The most frightening houses are not always abandoned because they are empty. Sometimes they are terrifying because they have been preserved too well. A room can keep a century in the grain of its floorboards. A corridor can hold on to an old route no one uses anymore. A bell wire can remain hidden behind plaster long after the hands that pulled it, answered it, and understood its code have gone into the ground. Historic buildings do this in ordinary, documented ways. They accumulate repairs, obsolete technologies, inherited furniture, altered lighting, sealed cupboards, and rooms that survive from different moments of use. A house is rarely one clean date. It is more often a stack of decisions. That was what I told myself when I first unlocked Ashmore House. I had inherited it from a great aunt I had met only twice, a woman my family described with the careful vagueness reserved for the difficult dead. Her name was Eleanor Vale. She had lived alone at Ashmore for almost 40 years, though alone was the wrong word, according to the solicitor. The house was full of furniture, full of papers, full of stored objects, full of wings that had not been properly opened since before I was born. The key came in a padded envelope with a short letter, a map of the local road, and a warning that sounded too practical to be dramatic. Do not force any interior door. That was all. No mention of ghosts, no family curse, no story about footsteps on the stairs. Just that one instruction, typed on the solicitor's letterhead, as if the doors themselves were part of the estate's legal condition. Ashmore stood at the end of a lane that narrowed between hedges and old stone walls. It was not a castle, not exactly a manor, and not modest enough to be called a farmhouse. It had the confused shape of a building that had been added to whenever money, fashion, or anxiety allowed. One side had tall sash windows and pale stone. Another had brickwork of a darker, meaner color. At the back, a service range crouched lower than the main house, with narrow windows and a separate entrance half swallowed by ivy. The front door opened with a sound like a throat clearing. Inside, the entrance hall smelled of wax, damp wool, and cold ash. That combination should have dated the place, but it did not. It only made the hall feel undecided. On one wall hung a dark mirror in a gilt frame. On another, a row of coat hooks had been screwed into paneling that looked much older than the hardware. Above me, a later electric fitting hung from a ceiling rose that seemed to belong to a more confident century. The bulb was dead. I had brought a torch. Its beam made the hall look theatrical, flattening one surface and then another. Wallpaper lifted in seams near the skirting boards. A runner lay on the floor, worn pale down its center. At the far end of the hall, a door stood open to a room where the light seemed colder, bluish, almost wintry, though the evening outside was damp and gold. I should say here that old houses can feel impossible without anything impossible happening. Historic England notes that many buildings dating before 1920 would originally have used candles, oil lamps, or gas mantle lighting rather than electricity. The Science Museum has pointed out that before gas or electric lighting, the fixed fire in the grate was often the main indoor light source. When those systems overlap in one building, when a room made for firelight later receives gas, then electric wiring, then modern replacement fittings, the result is not a timeline. It is a negotiation. Ashmore felt like a negotiation that had failed. The room to the left of the hall contained heavy curtains, a marble fireplace, and upholstered chairs arranged for conversation no one was having. It smelled faintly of coal smoke, though the grate was clean. The room to the right was narrower and older in feeling, with low beams, uneven boards, and a long table scarred by use. Its air smelled of dry wood and old flour, though there was no kitchen in sight. Farther down, a green-painted passage led toward the back of the house, where the temperature dropped sharply and the ceiling lowered, as if I had stepped not into another part of the same building, but into another rule for living. That was the first thing Ashmore did to me. It made style feel like weather. I had seen historic interiors before. I had walked through museum rooms where ropes, labels, and careful lighting made another century seem reachable but contained. I knew, in a general way, that a room could be curated to represent a chosen period of time. I knew that preservation did not always mean restoring something to a single original state. Some places protect layers. Some protect decline. Some keep the evidence of later use because the later use is part of the truth.
But Ashmore had no labels, no visitor route, no guard in the corner,
No polite barrier to remind me that the past had been arranged for viewing. The solicitor had advised me not to stay there on the first night. He said the heating was unreliable, the wiring had not been fully assessed, and parts of the roof might be unsafe after heavy rain. All reasonable concerns. I ignored them because inheritance creates a foolish intimacy. You receive walls and immediately begin to imagine that they are waiting for you. I carried my bag upstairs just before dusk. The staircase rose in a slow turn, its banister polished by generations of palms. Halfway up, I passed a landing window, mottled with age. The glass bent the garden outside into watery shapes. At the top, the corridor divided. The left side had faded wallpaper printed with small flowers. The right side had bare plaster, patched in places, with a line of servant bells mounted high on the wall near a narrow door. I stopped there. The bells were not decorative. They were part of an old domestic communication system, the kind used in large houses, where a pull in one room could move wires through walls and ring a bell elsewhere for the staff. Real systems like this could use wire linkages, coiled springs, pendulums, labeled boards, and differently sized bells, so servants could identify which room had called. They belonged to a practical world, a world of roots and hierarchy, where comfort upstairs depended on people moving unseen below. Ashmore's bellboard had 6 small bells, each under a painted label. Morning room, state bedroom, library, nursery, blue room, south chamber. The paint had browned with age. A few of the labels had cracked so badly that the names looked submerged. Beneath the bells, a narrow wooden shelf held a dish of dead flies. I stood there longer than I needed to. Nothing moved. The house settled around me in small, dry clicks. Then, somewhere behind the wall, a wire tightened. It was not loud at first. It was a delicate mechanical shiver, a tremor traveling through a hidden path. One bell began to move. Not ringing fully, not yet, but testing its own memory. The pendulum beneath it twitched once, twice, as if some invisible hand were pulling a cord very far away. The label beneath that bell read, Blue Room. I had not entered the blue room. I had not even found it. For several seconds, I did what people do when the unreasonable announces itself politely. I looked for the reasonable source. Wind. Mice. A loose wire settling under its own weight. The fatigue of an old mechanism responding to temperature. The house was neglected. It was damp. Materials expand, contract, slip, and complain. A building can sound alive without being alive. Then the bell rang properly. One bright, small note. It traveled down the corridor with terrible confidence. I waited for another sound after it, because bells are requests. They are made to be answered. Even a doorbell assumes the possibility of someone on the other side. A servant bell assumes more than that. It assumes a household organized around response. It assumes that somewhere there is a room with a person in need, and somewhere else there is a person whose duty is to go. The corridor remained empty. I took one step backward, and the floorboard beneath me sighed. The bell rang again. This time, I noticed that the air had changed. From the right-hand corridor came a faint smell of lavender, cold metal, and something like rain on fabric. The light at that end was different, too. Not darker exactly, but older in color, as if the daylight reaching it had been filtered through blue glass and distance. I raised the torch. The beam struck the wall and found a door I had not noticed before. It was painted a deep blue, though the paint had blistered in places. There was no keyhole at eye level, only a small brass plate around the handle, worn bright at the center. The door stood at the end of the corridor, where the map in my envelope showed only a linen cupboard and a blocked chimney. The bell gave one final tremble and went still. I should have left. I know that now, and I think I knew it then. But fear is not always a command to run. Sometimes it becomes a tension. It narrows the world until the only thing that exists is the next handle, the next breath, the next impossible fact that might become ordinary if you can only inspect it closely enough. I walked toward the blue door. The corridor seemed longer than before. The walls did not stretch. The floor did not tilt. Nothing so generous as a visible miracle occurred. But every step carried me farther from the house I had entered and deeper into the house that had been waiting underneath it. At the door, I remembered the solicitor's warning. Do not force any interior door. So I did not force it. I touched the handle lightly. It turned on its own. The room beyond was dark, but not empty. I could sense furniture before I saw it, the way one senses a person standing too close in an unlit room. My torch flickered once. In that brief stutter of light, I saw blue wallpaper, a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair turned toward the fireplace, and a bell pull hanging beside the mantel with its cord still swaying. Not much. Only enough to understand that the room had called from inside itself. Only enough to understand that Ashmore was not simply old, not simply layered, not simply neglected. It had rooms that behaved as if their chosen moments had never ended. It kept its different years apart like locked patients in separate wards, and now one of them had learned my name without hearing it. I closed the door without stepping in. Behind me, in the corridor, all 6 servant bells began to ring at once. Not wildly, not like an alarm, like a house announcing that the staff had arrived. The bells stopped before I found the courage to move. That was almost worse than the ringing. A sound can be argued with. Silence asks you to explain it yourself. I stood in Ashmore's corridor with my hand still on the latch of the blue room, listening to the last tremor leave the walls. Somewhere behind the plaster, something settled with the small tired click of metal returning to rest. Not a ghostly sound. Not theatrical. A practical sound, the sort made by wire, spring, and tension. The house had not screamed. It had signaled. And because I did not yet understand what it wanted from me, I did what frightened people often do when faced with the impossible. I tried to make it into a category. By morning, after a night spent in an armchair beside a cold fireplace, I had begun to think of museums. Not because Ashmore felt safe. It did not. But because museums have a way of teaching us how to stand in front of the past without touching it. They give us rules. They put velvet ropes between the living and the arranged dead. They place labels beside chairs, cabinets, mantels, and beds, and tell us not only what we are seeing, but how far we are allowed to believe in it. There is a term for the kind of room Ashmore seemed to be imitating. A period room. The Metropolitan Museum of Art describes a period room as an immersive interior meant to represent a particular period of time. That definition sounds simple until you feel what it implies. A period room is not only a collection of old things. It is a room designed to persuade the body. The light, the furniture, the wall treatment, the hearth, the height of the ceiling, the shape of the doorway, even the distance between objects all work together to say, for a moment, imagine you are standing somewhere else in history. The Met's American Wing in New York City is one of the clearest examples. Its historic interiors are arranged to tell roughly 300 years of domestic life, from 17th century Massachusetts to early 20th century Minnesota. Visitors move from one constructed domestic world to another, and the sequence can feel like walking through time by crossing thresholds. That, I realized, was what Ashmore had done to me on my first night. Only without guards, without labels, without exits marked in green. The difference matters because the Met is careful about what such rooms are and are not. A period room is not an untouched time capsule. It is not a sealed parlor opened after centuries to reveal the past exactly as it was left. It is an interpretation. It is shaped by scholarship, by museum trends, by curatorial taste, and by the collections available to the institution. It can be truthful without being literal. It can teach history while still being assembled. That caution should make a period room less frightening. At Ashmore, it did the opposite. Because once I understood the concept, I began to see that the house was not simply preserving the past. It was arranging it. Each room had the atmosphere of a chosen argument. The blue room was not merely old. It was insisting on a mood. Its narrow bed, its washstand, its chair turned toward the fireplace, its bell pull hanging beside the mantel as if some absent hand had just released it, none of these things felt accidental after dawn. They felt selected. The corridor outside had another grammar entirely. Its paper was darker, its woodwork more severe, its air carrying the mixed smells of dust, damp cloth, and something medicinal that did not belong to the blue room at all. Downstairs, the front hall had tried for a different authority. With a broad stair and portraits so smoke-darkened, their faces seemed less inherited then withheld. The house did not feel like one building decaying unevenly. It felt like a set of interpretations that had begun to enforce themselves. In a museum, that enforcement is gentle.
A room says, please imagine, please consider, please notice
That this chair, this carpet, this carved panel, this clock, this silver, belonged to a world with particular habits and hierarchies. A good period room is not only about style. It is about daily life made visible, how people sat,
how they received guests,
how they warmed themselves,
how they displayed wealth,
how they hid labor. Ashmore had taken that same principle and removed the word please. By mid-morning, I found an old writing desk in the library, though library was only my name for it. It may have been a morning room once, or a study, or a place that had changed its purpose each time a new owner wanted the house to flatter a new version of themselves. On the desk was no helpful family history, no neat inventory of rooms, no architect's plan. Only a drawer swollen shut by damp, a scattering of brittle envelopes, and a smell like old glue. I kept thinking of the American wing. 20 historic interiors, 3 centuries of domestic life. Rooms from different regions and periods, brought together under one museum roof so that the visitor could move through a national story, one interior at a time. Ashmore's arrangement was smaller and more private, but it obeyed a similar rhythm. Not a straight timeline, more like a mind sorting itself by rooms. Here, a bedchamber that wanted its bell answered. There, a dining room with the stale authority of a household that still expected service. Beyond it, a parlor whose curtains filtered the daylight into a color I associated less with weather than with old photographs. Each room seemed to have chosen a year or a narrow range of years and then dreamed it so hard that the rest of the house had to bend around it. The real danger, I began to suspect, was not that the rooms came from different times. It was that they believed representation was obedience. A curator understands the difference between an original setting and a historical suggestion. The Met openly acknowledges that period rooms are curated spaces, not literal untouched survivals. That honesty is essential. It gives the visitor a way to think. You are allowed to admire the illusion while remembering that it is an illusion. You can stand inside the past without surrendering your judgment to it. Ashmore offered no such mercy. If a room was arranged to represent a particular year, then the house seemed to treat that year as law. A bell pull did not hang as evidence of a service system. It called. A chair did not face the fireplace because the arrangement suggested a habit of warmth and conversation. It waited for someone to sit in it. A washstand did not demonstrate domestic routines before modern plumbing. It expected hands, water, a towel, a basin, a face in the mirror. And there was something else. The rooms did not agree with each other. In a museum, disagreement is managed. Galleries can place one period beside another because the institution controls the transition. Thresholds are explanations. Labels prepare you. The visitor understands that moving from one room to the next is a change in context, not a wound in reality. But at Ashmore, every threshold felt like a border crossing without permission. The air changed too abruptly. The light shifted in ways that did not match the position of the sun. Smells stopped at doorframes as though held back by invisible glass. A corridor might be cold and stale, while the room beyond held the faint sweetness of dried flowers, coal smoke, and polished wood. The house had not accumulated time peacefully. It had partitioned it. That was when I understood why the bells had frightened me so deeply. They were not merely sounds from the past. They were lines of authority running between rooms. A museum period room may evoke the relationships of a household, but Ashmore appeared to activate them. Somewhere inside its walls, the old idea of domestic order had survived not as memory, but as a command structure. The room called. Something or someone was supposed to answer. And now I was the only living person there. I spent that morning refusing to enter the blue room. Instead, I walked the corridor and looked at the doors as if labels might appear if I stared long enough. None did. Ashmore did not name its interpretations. It did not tell me which century I was approaching or which household I was trespassing through. It expected recognition. Worse, it expected compliance. Near the back of the ground floor, I found a door I had missed during the night. It was narrower than the others, tucked beside a stretch of paneling where the corridor bent toward the kitchen passage. Its brass knob was colder than the morning air. The wood around it was cleaner than the surrounding wall, as if hands had often found it in darkness. I should have left it closed. But by then, the museum idea had taken hold of me. I wanted to know what kind of room the house would make next. I wanted to see whether the illusion had seams, whether the year could be caught making a mistake. When the door opened, the first thing I noticed was not a ghost, or a figure, or a movement at the edge of sight. It was confidence. The room beyond was arranged with such certainty that for one breath I forgot to be afraid. Every object seemed to know its place. Every surface held its pose. The chairs, the table, the framed print above the mantel, the little objects set out as if for use but not quite touched, all seemed to be waiting for my eyes to accept the scene as complete. It was not simply old. It was staged. And somewhere in that perfect arrangement, something had already noticed I did not belong. I stood at the threshold longer than I should have, because the room seemed to reward hesitation. It did not invite me in the way an empty room invites entry. It presented itself. That was the difference. The chairs were not merely chairs. They had been angled with a social intelligence, as though the last conversation had ended only because someone had stepped away to fetch more light. The small table near the window held a closed book, a porcelain dish, and a pair of gloves laid palm down. On the mantel, 2 candlesticks flanked a framed print with a symmetry so exact it felt less like taste than obedience. Nothing moved. That was what made it unbearable. In the blue room, the air had been wrong, and the bell had been wrong, and I had felt the house trying to announce itself through sound. This room did not announce. It corrected. It had the air of a room that had been inspected, adjusted, and approved by some invisible curator who had no patience for doubt. I crossed the threshold. The floor gave a small complaint beneath my weight. Not a creak exactly, more like a word being swallowed. The door remained open behind me, but the corridor seemed farther away than it had a moment before. I could still see the dull line of it beyond the frame, the wallpaper darkened by damp, the strip of uneven boards, the world where Ashmore admitted it was neglected. Inside this room, neglect had been edited out. The wallpaper was pale, patterned with delicate leaves that had faded to a color like old tea. The carpet was worn in the center, but not carelessly. The wear seemed placed, almost theatrical, leading from the door to the hearth, from the hearth to the writing table, from the writing table to the window. Paths of imagined use. A life suggested by abrasion. That word came back to me. Suggested. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the warning about period rooms had seemed sensible, almost modest. Some rooms include furnishings that are not original to their architectural settings. They are chosen to suggest how an interior of that period may have appeared. It is a careful distinction, and an honest one. A museum can preserve a doorway, a mantel, a stretch of paneling, and then furnish around it with objects from the right general time, region, or style. The result can feel complete, but it is not an untouched room sealed since one perfect year. It is an argument, a scholarly arrangement, a way of helping the visitor imagine. Ashmore had taken that principle and stripped it of mercy. The room was not from one year. I could feel that before I could prove it. The mantel looked older than the furniture around it, heavy and formal, its carved edges darkened in the grooves. The chairs had a lighter refinement, their legs thin and exact, their backs curved as if made for a posture I did not naturally possess. The print above the fireplace had browned unevenly in its frame, but the frame itself looked cleaner, less tired, as though it had arrived later and been ordered to pretend. Near the window, the writing table held a brass inkwell beside a small object that might once have belonged to another kind of room entirely. Individually, each object made sense. Together, they were lying. Not loudly, not badly. That was worse. The lie had been made with knowledge. Whoever, or whatever, had arranged the room understood proportion, patina, distance, and mood. It knew how to create the feeling of a year without being bound to the facts of one. It knew that a visitor's eye is forgiving if the atmosphere is confident enough. I took out my phone to photograph the mantel. The room reacted before I touched the screen. A coldness gathered around my hand. Not the ordinary chill of an old house, but a narrow, directed cold, like the air had become a hand around my wrist. The gloves on the table shifted. I heard the faint, dry sound of kid leather sliding against polished wood. I lowered the phone. The gloves stopped. For several seconds, I listened to my own breathing and understood that I had made a mistake. Not by entering, by trying to document. Museums allow photography in some places and forbid it in others, but even where it is allowed, the camera changes the relationship. It turns immersion back into evidence. It reminds the room that it is being looked at from the present. This room did not want evidence. It wanted belief. I put the phone in my pocket slowly, as one might put down a weapon in front of someone easily offended. The cold loosened. The gloves remained where they were, though now one finger pointed slightly toward the hearth. That was when I noticed the coal scuttle. It stood near the fireplace, black and neatly angled. Too neat. Its surface was clean in the way display objects are clean, without the accidental smears of actual use. The fireplace itself held no living fire, only a set of arranged ashes, pale and soft-looking, formed into a shallow mound. I had seen that sort of theatrical stillness in historic interiors before, objects placed to imply daily life, but protected from the disorder that daily life produces. The room had a script. The book was closed because it had to appear recently read. The gloves were placed because someone had to appear recently present. The ashes were arranged because warmth had to be remembered without being allowed to happen. Then I saw the true flaw. On the small table beside the chair nearest the mantel sat a cup. It was turned slightly toward the seat, as if waiting for a hand. There was a stain inside it, dark at the bottom. The cup itself was delicate, with a thin handle and a painted rim, but beneath it lay a small square of paper, folded once, used as a coaster. That paper had a machine-cut edge. It was too white, too modern. Not new exactly, but not old enough for the room's performance. I might have missed it if I had not been looking for seams. The room noticed me noticing. The air changed. Not colder this time. Stricter. The chair beside the table gave a tiny scrape against the floor, though no one touched it. The cup trembled once, a small porcelain shiver. From inside the wall came a sound like wire tightening. I should have left the paper alone. I know that now. But there is a kind of fear that makes you obedient, and another kind that makes you foolishly investigative. I had inherited Ashmore, at least on paper. I had been told this was now mine. Some desperate part of me still believed ownership meant the right to touch. I reached for the square of paper. The moment my fingers closed around it, every object in the room seemed to inhale. The paper was not blank. On one side, faintly, was a printed fragment from a receipt or label. Not enough to identify a place. Not enough to date it cleanly. But enough to break the illusion. A scrap from the practical world, the world of purchases and handling and later arrangement. Proof that the cup had not waited untouched through a century. Proof that someone had placed it there. The room punished the proof. The mantel clock, which I had not heard ticking, began to tick all at once. The sound was loud, dry, and impossibly fast, though its hands did not move. The wallpaper darkened along its seams. The gloves slid from the table and dropped to the carpet with the soft weight of dead birds. The chair nearest me jerked backward, not violently, but with the offended precision of furniture making room for a person who had failed to stand correctly. A pressure settled on my shoulders. I understood, with a clarity that felt borrowed from the room itself, that I was not dressed for the scene. My jacket was wrong. My shoes were wrong. My phone in my pocket was an obscenity. Even my posture accused me. I was not behaving like the person the room had arranged itself to receive. The pressure increased until I bent forward. Not enough to fall. Enough to bow. The ticking stopped. I remained that way, half bent in the middle of the room, holding the little square of paper between my fingers. My back ached. My throat tightened. The room waited. It did not want to kill me, not yet. It wanted compliance. It wanted me to return the false evidence to its proper place and agree that the arrangement had always been whole. So I did. I set the paper back beneath the cup. Not exactly as it had been, perhaps, but close enough. The cup stilled. The chair slid forward by the width of a breath. The gloves lay quiet on the carpet, and after a moment I picked them up and returned them to the table, palms down, fingers aligned. The room warmed slightly. Approval. That was the worst part. Not the moving objects, not the sound in the walls. The approval. The sense that the room could be pleased if I learned how to lie with it. I backed toward the door without turning around. As I moved, I saw more of the room's delicate fraud. A stool, too rustic for the rest of the furniture, placed in shadow where it could contribute age without demanding explanation. A painted box whose colors belonged to another taste, another household, another inheritance. A mirror hung at the right height to reflect candlelight, though no candles had burned there in years. Each object had been recruited. Each had been made to serve a year it had not necessarily lived through. That was when Ashmore changed in my mind. Until then, I had imagined the house as confused. Rooms dreaming of different years, unable to agree on the present. But this room was not confused. It was interpretive. It selected. It arranged. It borrowed authority from age and hid contradiction inside atmosphere. It behaved like a period room with no label, no curator's note, and no patience for the visitor who asked what was original. At the threshold, I risked one last look. The room had already repaired itself around my intrusion. The gloves were calm. The cup waited. The book remained closed. The mantel and the chairs and the print above the hearth held their positions with that same unsettling confidence. If another person entered after me, they might admire it. They might say it felt authentic. They might never know the room had almost forced me to become part of the display. In the corridor, the air felt damp and undecorated. I leaned against the wall and listened to the servant bells in the distance, silent now, but not asleep. Down the passage, another door stood slightly open. Beyond it, I could see the edge of a different interior. Darker wood, a different kind of light, a deeper arrangement of space. Ashmore was not preserving rooms by accident. It was learning how to curate them. The open door down the passage did not feel like an invitation anymore. It felt like placement. That was the word that came to me as I stood there, breathing the damp corridor air of Ashmore, with the staged room still intact behind me. Placement, not haunting, not memory, not even preservation. The house was not merely keeping old things. It was deciding where they belonged, and then deciding where I belonged among them. I had read enough that day to understand why the thought frightened me. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's American Wing opened in 1924. That date matters because it marks more than the opening of a gallery. It marks a public confidence that American domestic history could be walked through room by room as if the interiors of private houses could be removed, studied, arranged, and made to speak inside a museum. The American Wing now uses 20 historic interiors to tell roughly 300 years of domestic life, from 17th century Massachusetts to early 20th century Minnesota. A visitor can move through those spaces and feel time change underfoot. Paneling darkens. Ceilings shift. Fireplaces become more elaborate, then less central. Woodwork, textiles, furniture, metalwork, glass, and paint begin to tell different stories about labor, taste, money, region, and aspiration. It is not simply a sequence of attractive rooms. It is a method, a way of teaching history through enclosure. You are not asked only to look at objects. You are asked to enter an argument about how people lived. But the museum is careful about what that means. The Met does not present these interiors as untouched slices of the past, sealed and transported whole into the present. They are curated spaces. They are shaped by scholarship, collection history, museum practice, and curatorial choice. Some furnishings were not original to the architectural setting around them. They were chosen because they help suggest how a room of that period might have appeared. That caution is important in daylight. At Ashmore, in the passage outside the open door, it became terrifying. Because the house had no caution. It had understood the outward form of the American Wing's lesson without understanding the restraint behind it. It had learned that rooms could represent time. It had learned that a doorway could become a threshold between domestic worlds. It had learned that a sequence could feel like history. But it had not learned the humane part of the practice, that interpretation remains interpretation, that a display is not the life it evokes, that the visitor is supposed to leave unchanged except by knowledge. Ashmore wanted more than knowledge. The door ahead opened into a darker room than the one I had escaped. The woodwork was heavier, not polished to shine, but deepened by age and touch. The light came low and amber, as though the room trusted the hearth more than the window. I did not step in at first. I stood in the corridor and let my eyes adjust. There was a table, but not like the delicate table in the previous room. This one looked built to endure use. There were chairs that seemed to hold their backs straighter than comfort required. A cupboard stood against one wall, its shelves arranged with a deliberate plainness that somehow felt more severe than ornament. The air smelled faintly of smoke, beeswax, and old wool. Nothing moved. That was the worst of it. The room did not need to move. It had achieved the stillness of a thing that believed it had already won. I thought of those 20 interiors in the American wing, not as a list, not as a tourist route, but as an idea, a procession of domestic environments, each one meant to bring a visitor into contact with another historical condition of home. 17th century Massachusetts at one end of the range, early 20th century Minnesota at the other. Not one household, not one family, not one continuous life, but a curated passage through different places, periods, and forms of American domestic space. Ashmore had its own passage. I saw that clearly then. The house was not random. Its mismatched rooms were not the result of eccentric inheritance, careless renovation, or generations refusing to throw anything away. Those things may have been true once. They may have given the house its raw material. But something in Ashmore had begun to sort the confusion. It had arranged the disorder into a route. The blue room behind me had not simply dreamed of another year. It had performed one. This new room was waiting to perform another. And beyond it, through a narrow opening at the far side, I could see the edge of yet another space. Pale wall, different molding, a higher window, a chair leg of a shape that did not belong with the heavy furniture before me. It was not a normal enfilade. Not a grand architectural alignment designed to impress a guest moving through formal rooms. It was closer to a museum path. One interior leading to another. One domestic world giving way to the next. Only there were no labels. No wall text. No velvet rope. No guard reminding visitors not to touch the furniture. No printed admission map showing where the 17th century ended and the 19th began. There was only the corridor behind me, the dark room ahead, and the faint sense that I had already been entered into a catalog. I crossed the threshold. The floor answered with a dry wooden note. Not a creak exactly, more like acknowledgement. The moment I was inside, the corridor seemed to withdraw. The dampness faded. The smell of plaster and closed air vanished behind the stronger scent of the room. Smoke, wax, wool, old timber. It was astonishing how quickly the house could change the terms of reality. A few steps, and the world became smaller, lower, governed by another idea of comfort. I touched nothing. After the previous room, touching felt like agreement. Instead, I walked slowly along the wall, studying the arrangement. The objects were not crowded. That made them more powerful. A chest stood beneath a small framed piece. A pair of candlesticks had been placed with a symmetry too calm to be accidental. The chairs faced inward, not toward me, as if the conversation they implied belonged to people who had stepped out only moments before. There was no dust on the tabletop, but dust lay in the corners. It was selective neglect, curated neglect. A museum period room has to make choices. It cannot show every life, every smell, every sound, every absence. It compresses. It suggests. It uses wood, fabric, ceramics, metal, architecture, and light to make a historical claim. Even when built from real materials, it is still a composition. Ashmore's horror was that it had begun composing with more than objects. When I reached the hearth, the air changed around my hands. Not warmer exactly, but expectant. I looked down and saw a narrow mark in the ash, as though something had been recently drawn through it. A line, then a turn, then another line. For a moment, I thought it might be writing, but it was more like a floor plan, a sequence of rectangles connected by openings. Rooms. I crouched before I could stop myself. The ash map showed the room I was in. Behind it, a smaller rectangle that must have been the blue room. Ahead, another shape. Then another. then a long bend to a wing I had not yet entered. The marks were too clean to be accidental. They looked less like a plan of Ashmore as it had been built, and more like an exhibition route drawn by a careful hand. At one point along the ash line, there was a small oval. I leaned closer. The oval was placed inside the rectangle where I crouched. It was not a symbol for furniture. It was not centered like a table or set against a wall like a chest. It stood just inside the threshold, exactly where I had paused after entering the room. The map had included me. I stood too quickly, and the room seemed to tighten. The chairs remained still. The candlesticks remained still. The cupboard, the chest, the table, the framed piece, all held their positions. But their stillness had changed. They were no longer waiting to be seen. They were seeing whether I would take my assigned place. That is when I understood the difference between walking through history and being arranged inside it. In a museum, the visitor moves from one room to another and remains, fundamentally, contemporary. You bring your own time with you. Your shoes, your phone, your weather, your fatigue, your private thoughts. The period room may surround you with another era, but it does not truly claim you. Its boundary is interpretive. You can step back into the gallery. You can read the label. You can leave. Ashmore removed those safeguards. There was no outside voice to say, "This is a reconstruction. This is a curated interpretation. This chair belongs to the period, but not to this exact house. This room represents a possibility rather than a total truth." Ashmore had stripped away every caveat and left only the immersive demand. Be convinced. Belong. I backed toward the threshold, but the door behind me looked farther away than it should have. The room had not grown larger. At least, I could not prove that it had. But the distance between objects had gained significance. The table was no longer just a table. It was an obstacle in the path of a role. The chair was no longer just a chair. It was a proposal. "Sit here," it said without language. "Sit here and complete the room." The servant bells rang once. Not all of them. Only one. The sound came faintly from somewhere beyond the wall, a single tremor traveling through a mechanism I had not yet found. It did not sound like panic. It sounded like a signal to staff that a visitor had entered the next gallery. Then, from the room ahead, a second bell answered. The ash in the hearth stirred without wind. On the map, the small oval marking me darkened. I left before the room could decide what I was meant to represent. I walked quickly, then faster, then nearly ran through the far opening into the next interior. The transition was immediate and disorienting. Heavy wood gave way to a paler room with different proportions, different light, different expectations. I did not stop to study it. I saw only enough to know that it belonged to another domestic imagination entirely. Beyond that was another door, and beyond that, another. Ashmore had built, or inherited, or dreamed its own American wing. Not with the Met scholarship, not with the careful honesty that admits a period room as an interpretation, but with the hunger of a house that wanted to make history continuous by force. I passed through 3 more thresholds before I found a corridor that did not seem arranged for display. There, the wallpaper peeled in long, tired strips. The carpet had faded into a color that might once have been red. A sagging curtain hung half loose from its rings, and the air smelled not of staged smoke or chosen wax, but of dust, damp fabric, and something stored too long to be remembered kindly. At first, the decay felt like escape. Then I noticed how carefully it had been left alone. At first, the decay felt like escape. Then I noticed how carefully it had been left alone. That was what changed the corridor. Not the damp. Not the paper lifting from the plaster in long, curling tongues. Not the carpet worn thin where generations of feet might have passed, or where no one had passed for years. It was the absence of correction. Nothing had been tidied into beauty. Nothing had been returned to what it might once have been. A tear in the curtain had not been mended. A dark bloom of water damage had not been painted over. A chair with one weakened leg leaned against the wall as if it had been retired mid-sentence, and yet the place did not feel abandoned. It felt protected. I had already seen what Ashmore could do with arrangement. I had seen rooms that performed the past like actors trained to hold a pose. I had seen interiors that treated history as something to be rebuilt, interpreted, forced into coherence.
This was different. This wing did not try to become one chosen year.
It refused the clean line that museums sometimes draw around a room, the line that says, "Here, for the length of your visit, let this be a particular moment."
Here, time had not been selected.
It had accumulated, failed, sagged, stained, and remained. The corridor bent slightly to the left, and the air changed with it. The smell deepened into old textiles, cold stone, dry wood, and the sweet, unpleasant powder of things breaking down slowly in enclosed air. My flashlight found wallpaper that had peeled away in overlapping sheets, revealing older paper beneath it, and beneath that, a colorless layer like exposed skin. In places, the pattern remained visible, a floral repeat, faded almost into ash. In other places, it had loosened so completely that the wall seemed to be shedding its own memory. I thought then of Calke Abbey in Derbyshire. Not because Ashmore looked exactly like it. It did not. But because Calke Abbey offers a real vocabulary for this kind of unease. The National Trust presents Calke Abbey as an unstately home, a phrase that matters because it reverses what many visitors expect from a country house.
The usual fantasy is polish, fine rooms restored to splendor.
A grand estate held at the height of itself, its decline discreetly edited away. Calke Abbey does something stranger and, in some ways, more honest. It shows the decline of a country house estate. That idea had seemed academic when I first read it. Standing in Ashmore's failing wing, it became intimate. Calke Abbey's rooms, according to the National Trust, were preserved as they were found. Not restored into a single chosen date. Not polished into one authorized version of grandeur. Preserved as found, with peeling wallpaper and large collections of unusual objects still crowding the house. The effect is not ruin in the romantic sense, not ivy and open sky and picturesque collapse. It is interior decline, domestic decline, the kind that happens indoors, slowly, among chairs, curtains, cabinets, books, and the stubborn remains of use. That was what Ashmore had begun to show me. A house can decay privately. A room can keep its dignity even while losing its surface. The farther I walked, the more I understood that neglect and preservation can look almost identical until you ask who is in control. In neglect, things are left because no one cares enough to intervene. In preservation, things may be left because someone has decided that intervention would destroy the evidence. The difference is intention, and intention, in a house like Ashmore, was never comforting. A doorway opened on my right. Inside, a room waited in half-darkness. I did not step in at first. The floorboards near the threshold looked warped, and the ceiling had a shallow sag that made the plaster seem tired of holding itself up. A long strip of wallpaper hung loose beside the window, moving slightly, though I could feel no draft. The curtains had collapsed inward from their own weight, their fabric weakened into soft folds, the lining browned by age and damp. A table stood crowded with objects I could not immediately name. Boxes, cases, bundles, a ceramic bowl filled with keys or bones or both. Against one wall, an armchair had been buried under folded textiles, each layer more faded than the one above it. It should have felt like disorder. It did not. The disorder had a boundary. Nothing lay where it had been thrown. Nothing had scattered with the randomness of panic. Instead, the objects had settled into a pattern of long habitation. They had not been displayed exactly, but neither had they been cleared away. It was the terrible middle state of an inherited room, too full to use, too meaningful to empty, too damaged to admire without guilt. Calke Abbey passed to the National Trust in 1985 after 12 generations of family occupation. That detail matters because it explains why the house is not simply an architectural object. It is a duration, a place occupied across roughly 3 centuries of country house life, layered with habits, tastes, economies, silences, and eventual decline. Before it opened to the public, Calke Abbey underwent extensive repairs from 1986 to 1988. Repair, in that context, did not mean erasing the evidence of deterioration. It meant stabilizing it, making it possible for the public to enter a house that still showed what had happened to it. That is a difficult idea to hold. Repair can preserve damage. Care can protect decay. At Ashmore, I began to suspect the house had learned that lesson without understanding mercy. The room before me had been stabilized, but not healed. The ceiling did not fall. The warped floor did not give way. The torn curtain did not disintegrate. The peeling paper never quite released itself from the wall. Every failing thing seemed arrested at the moment just before collapse. It was as if Ashmore had placed its hand over the wound and said, "Stay open." I crossed the threshold. The floor gave one careful creak under my weight, then held. The air in the room felt denser than the corridor, loaded with particles my flashlight made visible. They drifted slowly, each speck catching the beam like dust in a church. The comparison came before I could stop it, and once it arrived, I could not dismiss it. This room was not merely old. It was devotional. Not devoted to a god, or to a family, or to beauty, but to the act of not forgetting deterioration. The staged rooms had frightened me because they wanted to be believed. They demanded my cooperation. Sit here. Look there. Accept this year. Move like someone who belongs. This room did not ask me to believe anything. It asked me to witness. That was worse. A restored room can flatter the living. It can say, "Look how much has survived for you." A preserved decline says something colder. "Look how much has ended, and how little your arrival changes that fact." Calke Abbey is powerful because it resists the easy comfort of rescue. Its peeling wallpaper and crowded rooms make decline visible as history, not failure to be hidden. The National Trust's phrase, "unstately home," carries a quiet accusation. It asks why we expect the past to be neat before we will value it. Ashmore seemed to have taken that question personally. I moved toward the table. The objects on it were arranged in clusters, though I could not tell by what system. There were small boxes with warped lids, folded papers darkened at the edges, a cracked glass dome with nothing under it, a brush without bristles, a bundle of ribbon gone stiff with age, and several labels whose ink had faded beyond reading. On a lower shelf, I saw shells, fragments of metal, a nest, and something that might once have been a bird's wing, though I did not lean close enough to confirm it. The collection had not yet become the focus of the room, but it was waiting. This, too, reminded me of Calke Abbey, where large collections of unusual objects are part of the house's identity. Not a single display cabinet offered as a decorative curiosity, but collections spreading through rooms, part of the domestic atmosphere itself. The horror in such a place does not come from any one object. It comes from quantity, from the sense that the house has been receiving, storing, and refusing to release the world piece by piece. In Ashmore, the objects had the same pressure. They made the room feel occupied, though no one living sat there. They did not move. They did not need to. Their stillness had authority. The textiles sagged. The wallpaper peeled. The wood darkened and split. But the things remained in place, each one holding a portion of attention, like a hand closed around something small and dead. I turned back toward the door and saw, for the first time, that the inside of the room had a label frame beside the jamb. It was tarnished brass, green at the edges, the card inside browned and blistered. I wiped it gently with my thumb. No room name appeared. No date. No helpful curatorial title. Only 3 words, written in a narrow hand. As it was. I stood there with my thumb still on the frame, and the phrase seemed to open under me. As it was did not mean untouched. No old house is untouched. It meant found in decline, found crowded, found damaged, found after the money, labor, certainty, and appetite required to maintain it had begun to fail. It meant that the moment chosen for preservation was not youth or grandeur or completion, but exhaustion. Ashmore had not only learned to curate periods, it had learned to curate endings. The corridor outside felt longer when I returned to it. More doors waited ahead, their panels dulled by dust, their handles cold with disuse. Somewhere behind the walls, the old bell system remained silent, as if even the house understood that this wing did not require summons. Nothing here needed to call for help. Help would have been a violation. As I walked on, the rooms grew more crowded. Shelves appeared behind cracked glass. Cabinets stood with their doors swollen shut. Cases lined the walls in the dimness, beyond open thresholds. Shapes gathered inside them. Beaks, claws, fins, scales, delicate bones, the suggestion of fur dulled by time. The preserved decline had not been empty, after all. It had been making room for witnesses. The preserved decline had not been empty, after all. It had been making room for witnesses. That was how the next rooms received me. Not with movement, not with sound, but with the awful patience of things that had already outlasted fear. The corridor narrowed, and the cabinets began to crowd the walls, as if Ashmore had run out of rooms, and started storing its memory in every available inch. Glass-fronted cases stood shoulder to shoulder. Shelves sagged beneath boxes, jars, trays, and dark shapes whose labels had browned to the color of old tea. Some doors were locked. Some were not. In a few, the glass had cracked from corner to corner, but nothing inside had tried to escape. That was the first truth of the collection. It did not want release. It wanted recognition. I had seen natural history displays before in museums, and I knew the atmosphere they were meant to create: order, comparison, instruction. The world reduced to specimens. A wing beside a wing. A skull beside a skull. A bird fixed forever in the attitude of being almost alive. At Calke Abbey in Derbyshire, the National Trust describes not just peeling wallpaper and country house decline, but large collections of unusual objects, including natural history specimens displayed in many rooms. Birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles are part of that surviving atmosphere. They belong to a long habit of bringing the outside world indoors, naming it, arranging it, and believing that arrangement was a kind of mastery. Ashmore had learned that habit too well. In the first cabinet, small birds perched on branches that no longer pretended to be trees. Their feathers had faded in different ways. Some still held a dull mineral sheen at the throat. Others had softened into dust-colored silhouettes, as if time had rubbed species into shadow. Their eyes were glass, and that should have made them harmless. It did not. The glass eyes were not alive, but they were not empty either. They had the terrible advantage of never needing to blink. I found myself lowering my voice, though I had not been speaking. The room was not a laboratory, not exactly. It had the cluttered intimacy of a private house that had been asked to behave like an institution and had refused to do so neatly. There were trays of eggs beneath a cloudy pane. There were shallow drawers with handles worn by human fingers. There were bones, each one set in a way that suggested a system once understood by someone who had possessed both leisure and certainty. Higher shelves held shells, fragments of horn, and objects I could not identify in the dimness. Everything had been kept. Not necessarily cared for, but kept. There is a difference. Care imagines a future. Keeping can be more possessive than that. The room seemed to dream of an age when possession and knowledge could be mistaken for the same thing. A time when the collector's cabinet made the world smaller, when travel, empire, science, fashion, and private obsession could meet inside polished wood and labeled glass. A fish could be brought far from water. A reptile could be dried into posture. A mammal could be reduced to fur, teeth, and a little brass name. The living disorder of the world could be made to stand still long enough for a gentleman, or a family, or a visitor to look upon it and feel briefly superior to decay. But decay was still here. It had only entered by slower methods. The fur in one case had gone thin along the spine. The fish had the puckered look of something translated badly from life into object. A reptile lay curved on a bed of faded material, its scales catching what little light the room allowed. I could not tell if it had been arranged to appear restful or alert. That uncertainty made it worse. Nothing in the room attacked me. Nothing raised its head. The horror was not that preserved animals might return to life. That felt crude compared with what Ashmore was doing. They did not need to live again. They had already been assigned their places, and I had not. That thought came to me slowly, and once it arrived, I could not move through the room as I had before. I became aware of my own category, not as a person, not as an heir, not even as an intruder, but as an unlabeled thing passing among labeled things. Height, weight, condition, provenance, date acquired, state of preservation, missing parts, associated room, probable period. The air thickened around those imagined words. I leaned closer to one cabinet and saw that many of the labels were not legible anymore. Ink had spread. Paper had curled. Some names had been eaten away by damp, leaving only a few surviving letters and a line beneath them where certainty had once sat. Yet the failure of the labels did not make the collection less powerful. If anything, it made the room more possessive. Classification did not have to be accurate to be binding. The house had already proved that with its period rooms. A room did not have to be a true time capsule in order to punish the present for contradicting it. A collection did not have to understand a creature in order to claim it. I stepped back, and the floorboard gave a soft complaint. Every glass eye seemed to receive the sound. Not turn toward it. Not focus. Receive. That was the second truth of the collection. It was less interested in display than in witness. The birds had watched the wallpaper peel. The mammals had watched the curtains rot. The fish had watched damp move through plaster like a tide. The reptiles had watched generations of human ownership collapse into an inventory problem. Their stillness had outlasted the hands that dusted them, the voices that named them, the family that accumulated them, and the confidence that such accumulation meant permanence. In their company, I felt embarrassingly brief. The living body is always unfinished. It sweats, shivers, hungers, heals badly, remembers selectively. It leaves fingerprints on glass and breath on cold surfaces. It makes mistakes in rooms that have no tolerance for mistakes. Surrounded by preserved things, I began to understand why the house preferred objects. Objects did not argue with their placement. A cracked shell stayed cracked. A mounted bird remained obedient to its wire. A jar, even clouded, kept its contents from becoming fully lost. The living, by contrast, kept changing. Perhaps that was why Ashmore had begun arranging me. On a central table, beneath a cloth stiff with dust, I found a ledger. Its cover had warped, and the first pages resisted my hand. I should not have opened it. That is easy to say now. At the time, the act felt almost polite. A collection invites reading. A label asks to be consulted. An inventory promises that disorder has been translated into meaning. The entries were written in an old, careful hand at first. Lines of objects, cabinets, rooms, conditions, occasional notes on damage. Later hands appeared, less steady, then more hurried. Some pages contained nothing but lists of repairs that had not been made. Others recorded specimens moved from one room to another, as if the collection had migrated through the house while the family around it declined. Near the back, the paper changed. It was newer than the rest. My name was there. Not written in the old hand. Not in ink faded by decades. It stood in a thin, recent line, as if added shortly before I entered the room or shortly after. Beside it were spaces for details not yet completed. Date of arrival. Condition on arrival. Room of first placement. Subsequent movement. Notes. Under classification, a single word had been entered. Living. For a moment, that seemed almost comforting. Then I understood the cruelty of it. Living was not a reprieve. It was a temporary condition, the way fresh color is temporary, the way a taut thread is temporary, the way a house can be called inhabited until the last person inside it becomes another thing the building has kept. I closed the ledger carefully. The cabinets made no sound. The bell system behind the walls remained silent. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a clerk waiting for a form to be completed. At the far end of the room, beyond a rank of cases holding birds with long, curved beaks, I saw a door almost hidden behind a screen and several stacked frames. It was not like the doors I had passed through earlier. This one had been sealed with a seriousness that felt ceremonial rather than practical. Heavy fabric had been tacked along its edges to keep out dust or light or attention. The wood showed no ordinary handle, only a dark plate where one might once have been. Above it, on a narrow shelf, sat objects wrapped in stained cloth. The shape of one suggested a carved finial. Another looked like a length of folded textile, too carefully stored to be a rag, and too richly colored, even through dust, to belong among the neglected cases. I thought of rooms preserved as found, of decline kept intact, of collections that turned the world into evidence. Then I smelled something that did not belong to the cabinets. Old silk, closed air, and, beneath both, the faint dry scent of a bedchamber that had been waiting behind a sealed door for a very long time. The smell came first, and then the room. I had expected resistance from the sealed door. I had expected swollen wood, rusted hinges, some argument between my hand and the house. Instead, when I pressed the dark plate where the handle should have been, the fabric tacked around the frame loosened with a soft tearing sound, as if it had been waiting for permission to fail. The door opened inward. The air that moved out was not the damp air of the corridor, nor the mineral cold of plaster and stone. It was warmer, though no fire had been lit. It carried silk, dust, old wood, and something faintly sweet that might once have been perfume trapped in cloth. Not fresh perfume, not even stale perfume. The idea of perfume, remembered by thread. My candle flame leaned away from the opening. Inside, the bedroom was almost completely dark. Heavy shutters covered the window, and over those shutters hung curtains so thick that the outside world seemed less blocked than denied. The walls were paneled in a manner older than the corridor outside, but the ceiling had been repaired at some later date. I could see where a crack had been plastered across an older cornice. The floorboards did not match. One side of the room had narrow boards worn smooth with use. The other had broader replacement planks, paler under the dust. It should have been another layered room, another argument between periods. But the bed silenced everything around it. It stood in the center of the chamber, too large for the room and too formal for sleep. 4 tall posts rose like columns, carved and dark, supporting an elaborate canopy. From it fell embroidered hangings, dulled by age, but still magnificent in the candlelight. The silk had faded unevenly, yet color remained in protected folds, old red, green, blue, gold thread, catching light for a moment, and then losing it again. Figures and flowering shapes moved across the fabric, not because the cloth stirred, but because my flame made every stitch seem uncertain. I had seen enough by then to know that Ashmore did not merely keep furniture. It installed objects where they could exert pressure. A common bed invites the body to rest. This one demanded an audience. There are objects in historic houses that do not behave like possessions. They behave like events that have outlived the people who arranged them. A chair can be moved from room to room and become ordinary. A cabinet can be emptied and filled again. But a state bed is different. It is not only furniture. It is rank made visible. It is ceremony translated into wood, textile, height, and distance. It tells the visitor that lying down may be the least important thing ever done inside it. That was why the object reminded me so sharply of Calke Abbey in Derbyshire. The National Trust presents Calke Abbey as an unstately home, a place where the decline of a country house estate was not polished away into a chosen golden age. Its rooms were preserved as they were found, with peeling wallpaper, crowded collections, and the evidence of life left awkwardly intact. But among that carefully preserved decline is something astonishing, a Baroque state bed with Chinese embroidered silk hangings, probably made for George I around 1715, and later given to Lady Harper in 1734. The dates matter. A bed like that can be older than the room in which a visitor sees it. It can carry one historical moment into another, then another after that. It can be made for a king, given to someone else, stored, moved, inherited, forgotten, displayed, and still remain itself. The room around it may change its wallpaper, its floor, its lighting, even its purpose. The bed continues to insist on the ceremony of its origin. Standing in that sealed bedroom at Ashmore, I understood this in a way no museum label could have taught me. The room was not dreaming of a single year. The bed was. Everything else had been forced to accommodate it. The paneling behind the headboard looked slightly wrong, as if cut down or adapted to make space. A faded rug stopped short of the bed's feet, not worn away, but interrupted. 2 chairs stood against the wall at an angle too respectful to be useful. They were not placed for conversation. They were placed for waiting. On a small table beside the bed lay a folded cloth, a cracked basin, and a book whose cover had darkened almost to black. I did not touch them. The house had already taught me that contact was a kind of agreement. Instead, I walked slowly around the bed. The hangings were worked with an intricacy that felt excessive until I imagined the world that had made them necessary. Silk was not just softness. Embroidery was not just decoration. Imported fabrics, elaborate textiles, carved posts, and canopies all spoke in a language of status. A state bed could announce connection, taste, wealth, and favor before anyone had said a word. And if the Calke Abbey bed had probably been made for George the First around 1715, then given to Lady Harper in 1734, it carried not only a date, but a transfer of significance. It had belonged to one ceremonial imagination, and then entered another household's memory. The object was evidence that time in a house is not always built into the walls. Sometimes it arrives on a cart, wrapped in cloth, and becomes older than its surroundings the moment it is carried through the door. Ashmore had learned that lesson too well. At the foot of the bed, the air seemed denser. My candle burned lower, though no draught touched it. I saw then that the embroidered hangings were not merely suspended. They enclosed. The curtains at the sides were tied back, but the knots had been loosened, as if someone had recently begun to draw them shut and stopped. The mattress beneath the coverlet was high and unnaturally smooth. No sag, no human hollow, no sign of use except one slight depression near the center, so shallow that I might have imagined it. The coverlet was patterned with threads that had blackened at the edges. When I leaned closer, the design resolved into crowns, leaves, curling stems, birds with long necks, and flowers that seemed to grow from nowhere. Then the room changed its light. Not dramatically. The candle did not go out. The shutters did not open. But the darkness around the bed warmed, and for a moment the silk recovered more of its color than time should have allowed. The reds deepened. The gold brightened. The blue figures sharpened. I could almost see what the bed wanted to be. Not a ruin in a sealed room, not an inherited object in a decaying house, but a prepared ceremonial center, waiting for witnesses. The chairs against the wall looked occupied. Not visibly. There were no faces, no bodies, no ghostly hands folded in laps. But the emptiness above each seat had become attentive. The room had arranged itself around an expectation, and I was standing where I should not have stood. The bed did not ask me to sleep. It asked me to enter the year it remembered. I thought again of period rooms, of curated interiors that openly represent a chosen historical period, and of the warning that such rooms are interpretations rather than untouched time capsules. The danger in Ashmore was that it had mistaken representation for obedience. Earlier rooms had staged a past and punished anything that broke the illusion. But this bedroom was different. It was not assembled from several objects pretending to agree. It was dominated by one object strong enough to make every surrounding surface lie on its behalf. The repaired ceiling, the mismatched floorboards, the later dust, the sealed door, even my candle, all of it had become secondary. The bed held the date, around 1715, 1734. Not as facts in a guidebook, but as conditions of entry. I took one step back. The boards creaked beneath me, and the sound seemed indecently modern. The room tightened. The tied-back hangings at the nearest post slipped a little, not falling open, but closing by the width of a breath. I could hear silk dragging against silk, dry and intimate. On the table beside the bed, the dark-covered book opened by itself. Only a little. Enough for its pages to lift and settle. I did not read it. I did not want to know whether my name had been written there, or some older version of my name, adjusted to fit the household's expectations. The horror of that room was not that it contained a dead king, or a sleeping lady, or a figure waiting under the coverlet. The horror was quieter. It was the possibility that an object made for ceremony might continue to require ceremony after everyone who understood it had vanished. A bed can remember rank. A room can remember attendance. A house can remember how people were meant to move around power. That was when I noticed the cord. It hung beside the bed, partly hidden in the embroidered fall of silk. At first I mistook it for another decorative tassel. Then I saw that it passed through a small hole in the wall near the headboard, its color darkened by handling long after the silk around it had been left untouched. It was not part of the bed's original magnificence. It belonged to the room's service life, to the practical world behind ceremony. A pull cord, a summons. The bed had not only waited to be seen, it had waited to be answered. I should have left then, and perhaps I did. Memory becomes uncertain at thresholds right. I remembered backing toward the door without turning my back fully on the bed. I remember the candle flame shrinking until it was only a blue bead at the wick. I remember the hangings slowly drawing closer together, as if the bed were closing its own mouth. Then, from somewhere behind the wall, came a small metallic tremor. Not loud, not yet a bell, only the first delicate movement of a mechanism waking after a long sleep. Wire shifting in darkness, a spring taking strain, a distant pendulum beginning to quiver in a part of the house I had not entered. The sealed bedroom held its breath, and behind the walls, something heard the call. Behind the wall, the first sound was not supernatural. That made it worse. A ghost, at least, would have been an answer the house wanted me to accept. A figure at the foot of the bed, a hand on the curtain, a face in the old glass. But the tremor I heard after touching that pull cord belonged to a different order of fear. It was mechanical. It had weight, direction, and purpose. Something had moved because something else had been pulled. The state bed remained behind me, its embroidered hangings gathering the candlelight into dull folds. I did not look at it for long. The sound inside the wall was too precise. A wire had tightened. A spring had accepted the strain. Somewhere beyond the bedroom, in a part of Ashmore not meant for display, a small instrument had been given a message. That was when I began to understand that the house did not only preserve rooms, it preserved relationships. A bedroom like that was made to be seen, or at least to suggest being seen, even if its grandeur had outlived the ceremony that once explained it. But service spaces are different. They are designed around absence. Their purpose is to make labor appear only when required, and then disappear again. The more polished the room, the more carefully hidden the work behind it often becomes. In British country houses from the 18th century onward, that hiding became part of the architecture. Servants were increasingly moved out of sight. Service wings, basement routes, tunnels, back stairs, utility rooms, and concealed corridors kept the daily labor of the house separate from the rooms of family, guest, and ceremony. The result was not simply a house with grand rooms and plain rooms. It was a house with two circulatory systems, one for those who were meant to be observed, one for those who were meant to hear, carry, clean, mend, fetch, and vanish. Ashmore had such a second body. I found its entrance by accident, or by obedience. The sound in the wall had faded, but the pull cord had changed the room around me. A narrow panel near the fireplace, which I had taken for a warped section of wainscot, now stood open by the width of my fingers. There was no dramatic passage, no Gothic arch, no carved invitation, only a black vertical crack and a draft smelling of cold lime wash, iron dust, and extinguished coal. I pushed the panel inward. The corridor behind it was too narrow for comfort. Not impossible, not theatrical, just mean. Its plaster had been rubbed smooth at shoulder height. The floorboards were undecorated and dipped slightly at the center, as if generations of quick feet had worn a shallow channel through the house. No portraits hung here. No chairs had been arranged to flatter a visitor. The walls carried old pipes, boxed-in runs, and dark cords that disappeared into holes drilled through timber. This was the house without performance. Or rather, this was the performance machinery. The corridor passed behind the bedroom wall and continued downward by a flight of cramped stairs. I had seen old service stairs before in preserved houses, and I had always understood them visually, narrow, steep, practical. But Ashmore made me hear them. Every board complained in a different register. Every turn seemed built to muffle one sound and amplify another. A dropped tray, a whispered order, a bell from upstairs. The house had once been organized around knowing which noises mattered. At the bottom, the passage widened into a low service hall. The ceiling was crossed by beams, and the plaster between them had browned with age. A stone sink stood against one wall. Beyond it were doors to rooms whose purposes were still legible even after abandonment. A scullery, perhaps, a store, a place for coal or linen or tools. The grand rooms upstairs had tried to inhabit different years with wallpaper, furniture, light, and ceremony. These spaces dreamed in tasks. Waiting, carrying, answering. Then the bell rang. It was small, sharp, and close enough that I flinched before I understood it. The sound came from the far end of the service hall, where a wooden board hung above a long table darkened by use. I raised the candle and saw a row of bells fixed beneath the board, each mounted on a metal spring, each connected to a wire that vanished upward or sideways through the wall. Some bells were larger than others. Some had tarnished mouths. Beneath or beside them were labels, darkened by grime, naming rooms in a hand almost too faded to read. This was not decoration. It was an instrument. Historic servant bell systems were built for exactly this kind of domestic command. A person in a room could pull a cord or press a fitting, and that action would travel through wires and sprung linkages hidden in walls, ceilings, or service routes. The signal arrived at a bell board, often labeled so staff could identify which room had called. Coiled springs, pendulums, and differently sized bells could help distinguish one summons from another. A house could speak without raising its voice. It could name the place where service was required. Ashmore still knew how. The bell that had rung was still moving. Not swinging wildly, not as a modern alarm would, but trembling with a controlled impatience. Its little pendulum flickered beneath it. The label above was half obscured, but I could make out enough. State bedroom. Of course. The bed had called, and the hidden house had answered. I stood there, with the candle held low, watching the motion die. The horror of it did not come from mystery. It came from continuity. A practical system, built for a practical household, was still functioning after the household had vanished. No butler waited under the board. No maid lifted her head from work. No footman marked which bell had moved and set off through the correct passage. Yet the command still arrived. The mechanism had outlived the people who knew what to do with it. That is a particular kind of haunting. Not a soul trapped in a room, but a duty trapped in a system. A wire does not know that the century has ended. A spring does not understand inheritance. A pendulum does not ask whether the person who pulled the cord is alive, invited, authorized, or terrified. It only transfers motion. It only repeats the old instruction. Someone upstairs requires attendance. The board was larger than it had first appeared. As my candle steadied, more labels emerged from the dark. Morning room, library, west dressing room, nursery, dining room, blue chamber. Names I had seen on doors and names I had not. Some labels belonged to rooms I had entered and wished I had not. Others belonged to spaces Ashmore had not yet shown me. Several wires were slack. Others were taut as if under a strain that never fully released. One line disappeared into the ceiling and gave a faint tick, 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 too slow for a clock and too irregular for dripping water. I thought of the house above me, arranged as a sequence of curated interiors, staged decline, preserved collections, and a bed that remembered a royal date older than its surroundings. Down here, beneath all that visible time, the infrastructure connected everything. Not by style, by need. The visible rooms argued with one another about what year they belonged to. The service system did not argue. It linked them all as if the household were still whole. That was the unbearable part. These bells did not care whether the rooms were Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian, or something assembled later by curators, inheritors, or decay. They did not ask whether the room was original, restored, preserved as found, or dreaming falsely. Each bell made the house practical again. Each label insisted that the room above had a right to summon. I moved closer to the board and saw dust gathered on the table below it, except where small crescent marks had been disturbed beneath several bells. Recent movement. Not one call, then. Not only the state bedroom. The house had been ringing before I came downstairs, and perhaps before I arrived at Ashmore at all. I had simply been too far inside the public rooms to understand what the sound meant. The corridor behind me seemed to narrow in memory. I imagined servants moving through it without hesitation, trained not only in the geography of the house, but in its acoustic language. A bell was not just a noise. It was information. The shape of its ring, the place of its label, the urgency of its tremor, all of it translated into action. Someone once could have stood where I stood and known instantly which staircase to take, which door not to use, which tray to carry, which face to prepare. I knew none of that. Ashmore knew I knew none of it. Another bell stirred. This time it did not ring fully. It lifted on its spring, shivered once, and settled. A muted test, as if the house were clearing its throat in a room far above. The label beneath it read, "Nursery." The air in the service hall grew colder. Then, from somewhere to my left, a second mechanism answered. Not a bell, but the faint pull and release of wire through a pulley. A small pendulum on the board began to move, though no sound followed. I watched it wag back and forth in the candlelight. Its motion was almost gentle, almost patient. The house was not trying to frighten me with noise. It was teaching me to listen. That was when the building changed for me. Until then, I had been navigating by rooms, by wallpaper, furniture, smell, light, and the peculiar pressure each chamber exerted on time. But behind the walls, Ashmore had another map. A map of calls and routes. A map drawn not for owners or guests, but for those expected to appear at the edge of a room and make themselves useful. I looked again at the labeled board. The state bedroom bell had stopped moving. The nursery pendulum had not. Somewhere above, a room I had not entered was still asking to be answered. And in the service passages around me, beyond the reach of the candle, I heard the faintest succession of sounds, one spring tightening, another releasing, a wire lifting from its long sleep, and then, very softly, a bell beginning to ring not once, but in a pattern. The pattern began so softly that I almost mistook it for the house settling. One bell, then a pause. Two shorter notes, a longer silence. Then another bell answering from farther along the board, its tone thinner, almost apologetic, as if it had been made for a smaller room or a less important one. I stood in the service passage with my candle held low, watching the labeled board shiver in sections. The pendulums did not move together. They took turns. Nursery, state bedroom, morning room, library, a blank label where the ink had faded to the color of old tea. The horror of it was not that the bells rang. By then, I had accepted that Ashmore still contained working parts no living person had maintained. The horror was that the ringing had grammar. Historic servant bell systems were built for clarity. That was their purpose. In large houses where servants had been moved out of sight, especially from the 18th century onward, the household still needed a way to make invisible labor appear exactly where it was wanted. A pull in a bedroom, a drawing room, or a dining room could set a wire moving behind plaster or above ceiling voids. That motion traveled through a route no guest was meant to notice, around corners and through service spaces, until it reached a bell in the servants' hall or another working area. A labeled board told the staff which room had called. Differently sized bells, varied tones, coiled springs, and little pendulums helped distinguish one summons from another. It was practical technology, almost domestic in its honesty. A room wanted something. A hand pulled. A bell answered. Someone came. In Ashmore, the first and last parts of that exchange had gone wrong. There was no living hand at the pull. There was no staff waiting to obey. And still, the middle of the system worked with awful devotion. The morning room bell gave 3 light taps. The pendulum beneath it swung hard to the left, then settled in a trembling arc. Before it stopped, the nursery bell moved again, not loudly, but with insistence. Its tone was higher, quicker, almost childish, and I hated myself for hearing it that way. Bells do not have ages. Metal does not plead. But the house had already taught me that objects could be arranged until they seemed to remember what they had only represented. I stepped closer to the board. The wood around the labels had darkened with use. Not polished exactly, but handled by years of glances and quick decisions. A servant entering this passage would not have needed to think about the system as a marvel. They would have known the hierarchy by sound. The larger bell for the room with social weight. The smaller one for a secondary chamber. The sharpness of a spring newly pulled. The afterswing of a pendulum showing where the call had come from even after the ringing stopped. That detail mattered. The pendulum was memory made mechanical. A bell could fall silent too quickly to identify, especially in a busy house. But a small indicator, still moving after the note faded, preserved the event for a few moments longer. It told the watcher, there. That room. Go there now. Ashmore had kept those few moments open for decades. The state bedroom pendulum gave one last twitch and stopped. The library began. Its bell was deeper than the others, though not larger by much. The sound traveled through the narrow passage and returned from the plaster in a low, dry murmur. I imagined the room on the other side of the house, lined with dark shelves, perhaps dreaming itself into a year when the family still wrote letters by a window and expected the fire to be laid before breakfast. I had not entered it yet, but the bell knew me. Or rather, the room knew the system. It believed there was someone below stairs whose duty was to answer. I took out the little notebook I had been using for names, dates, and impossible observations. Until that moment, my notes had been visual. Wallpaper faded to a tobacco yellow. Bed hangings with embroidered silk. Cabinets of birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles. A corridor turning where no corridor had been shown on the estate papers. But now, sight felt like the least trustworthy sense in the house. Every room staged itself too well. Each one insisted upon its own evidence. Sound was harder for the rooms to disguise. So I began to map Ashmore by ringing. At the top of the page, I wrote the labels as I saw them on the board. Then I waited. Nursery, 2 short rings after every longer pause. Library, 1 deep pull, followed by a faint recoil in the spring. Morning room, 3 quick taps. State bedroom, silent for now, though I could feel it in the wall like a held breath. I listened for distance, too. Some bells seemed to speak from directly above the passage. Others arrived delayed, with a little scrape first, as though the wire had to negotiate several turns before reaching the board. That delay told me something about the route. The nursery was not merely upstairs. Its call traveled around a bend, perhaps through a ceiling void or behind the back stair. The library had a cleaner line. The morning room sounded close but weak, which suggested either a smaller bell or a tired spring. In an ordinary country house, this would have been an archive of labor. Not a written one, not the sort kept in a family chest or museum catalog, but a physical record of expectation. Where were servants allowed to walk? Which walls hid their roots? Which rooms had the right to summon? Which bells were large enough to be heard over work, voices, and the clatter of a kitchen? The system answered all of that. Ashmore answered something else. The blank label rang. I had been avoiding it. There is a particular fear in an unnamed thing that has been given the same machinery as named ones. The bell above the faded label was not large, but the sound had an odd brightness, as if the metal had been protected from air. Its pendulum swung in a tight, decisive motion. Once. Twice. Then it held at an angle that should not have been possible, as though the mechanism had caught on an invisible instruction. From somewhere far away in the house came the faint sound of a door settling into its frame. Not opening. Not closing. Preparing. I wrote, blank label, bright bell, no known room. Then I crossed out room and wrote year. That was the first time I admitted what the bells were really doing. The house was not summoning servants. It was summoning periods of itself. Each label was not only a location, but a claim. Nursery did not mean a room with toys. It meant the year in which that nursery believed it was occupied. State bedroom did not mean a bedchamber. It meant the ceremony of a bed that remembered an older dignity than the plaster around it. Library was not shelves and chairs. It was a household still waiting for someone to trim the light, bring coal, open shutters, carry a tray, remove a letter, close a curtain. Every ring was an instruction from a room that believed the household was still alive. And because I had inherited the place, because my name now sat somewhere in the legal remains of Ashmore, the instructions had begun to include me. The ringing spread. Not louder. That would have been easier. Noise can be resisted. This became more orderly. A bell would sound from the board. Then something in the passage would answer. A tap in the pipework. A soft pull through the wall. A tremor above my head. I followed with my notebook and candle, counting steps between tones. The service corridor narrowed, then divided. One branch sloped downward toward the cold smell of stone and old utility rooms. Another rose by shallow steps, too plain for guests, too careful to be accidental. The bells guided me better than the floor plan. At one point, the nursery rang twice, and I turned left without deciding to. The passage brought me behind a section of wall where I could hear, very faintly, the air of an upper room. Not voices, not movement. A held atmosphere. I pressed my ear to the plaster and heard a small wooden sound, like a chair settling under the weight of someone who was not there. Then the morning room rang 3 times. The sound moved through the wire beside my face. I felt it before I heard it. A delicate tightening, a message traveling through the bones of the house. That was what made the mechanism so intimate. It did not float in the air like a haunting. It used structure. It turned walls into nerves. I began to understand why these systems belonged so naturally to horror. A servant bell is a command that survives the person who gives it. It is also a reminder that domestic life was never contained only in the visible rooms. Behind the comfort of a drawing room or bedroom lay roots, labor, waiting, and response. The beautiful side of the house could pretend to be effortless because the hidden side was always listening. Ashmore had preserved the listening after everything else failed. The board rang again. This time, all the pendulums moved except one. The state bedroom remained still. I thought of the bed behind its hangings, the old silk closing like a mouth. That room had already made its demand. It did not need to repeat itself. Other rooms were now taking their turn, not in panic, but in sequence. A household routine. A morning schedule. A list of expectations moving through dead infrastructure. Nursery. Morning room. Library. Blank. Nursery again. Then a label I had not noticed before, half hidden by soot at the edge of the board. Lamp room. The bell beneath it gave a single dull note. The candle in my hand guttered. Until then, I had thought of the bells as a map of space and year. Now, I saw that they were also calling for conditions. Not merely for a person to appear, but for the right world to be restored before that person entered. A nursery might require one kind of warmth. A library, another kind of glow. A state bedroom might tolerate only flame low enough to flatter silk and shadow. Somewhere else, perhaps, a room would not wake properly until gas hissed through a mantle, or until an early electric fitting shivered with the confidence of a newer age. The lamp room bell rang again. This time the note was not a summons. It was a warning. My candle flame leaned hard to the right, though there was no draft in the passage. Far ahead, beyond the service stair, a thin line of light appeared under a door I had not opened. It was not the warm orange of wax. It was not firelight. It was paler, steadier, and somehow more improper in that part of the house. The bells fell silent all at once. In the hush, I understood that Ashmore had finished teaching me to listen. Now it wanted me to learn which light belonged to which year. The line of light under the unopened door seemed too steady for Ashmore. By then, I had learned to distrust anything in that house that behaved with confidence. The bells had taught me that a sound could be practical and still be terrifying. The service passages had taught me that a hidden mechanism did not have to be alive in order to obey a vanished command. Now the house was teaching me the same lesson with light. I stood at the turn of the passage, candle in hand, watching that pale strip burn beneath the door. It did not tremble as my flame did. It did not breathe with the chimney drafts or flutter when the boards cooled beneath my feet. It simply existed, level and improper, as if some later century had slipped a card beneath the threshold. The candle knew it was wrong before I did. Its flame bent away from the door and thinned until the wick was only a black nail in a cup of wax. Behind me, in the dark of the service corridor, the bell board remained silent. That silence had become another kind of instruction. No room was calling now. The house was waiting to see whether I would answer correctly. I did not open the lit door at once. Instead, I turned back toward the rooms I had already passed, because the pattern had begun to reveal itself. Ashmore was not merely divided by wallpaper, furniture, or use. It was divided by illumination. Earlier, in the oldest feeling room near the rear of the house, my candle had been almost useless. The room had accepted the flame, but only grudgingly, as if a handheld light was a nervous modern habit. The proper brightness there came from the fixed fire in the grate. When I had stirred the ash and uncovered a low red seam beneath it, the walls had settled. The chair beside the hearth had become less hostile. The long table, which had looked warped and uncertain by candlelight, found its shape in the glow from the fire. That detail mattered because it was not an invention of the house. The Science Museum notes that before gas or electric lighting, the main indoor light source was often the fixed fire in the grate. We tend to imagine old interiors lit by wandering candles, each person carrying a little golden circle through the dark. But for much of domestic life, the hearth was not only heat, it was orientation. It was the clock of the evening in the center of the room's attention. Faces turned toward it. Furniture gathered around it. Shadows belonged to it. In Ashmore, that old dependence had become a rule. The room did not want light in general. It wanted its own light, from its own source, in its own place. When I lifted the candle too high, the corners seemed to retreat. When I lowered it and let the grate speak, the room remembered where it was supposed to be. Not safe. Never safe. But legible. Farther along the passage, the small room I had thought of as the oil room had made a different demand. I had known it before I saw the lamp. The smell gave it away. A stale, mineral heaviness worked into the curtains and the wood, as if the walls had absorbed years of careful trimming, filling, and wiping. On a side table sat a lamp with a glass chimney clouded at the lip and a reservoir that still held a dark skin of old fuel. The air around it felt greasy. Not filthy exactly, but handled, maintained, domestic in the most anxious sense. When my candle entered that room, the shadows became crowded. They jumped behind the framed prints and made the mantel ornaments appear to turn their heads. But when I set the candle down and touched a match to the lamp, the place altered. The flame took hold with a small pulse. The chimney warmed. The room's darkness rose upward instead of outward, gathering above the lamp glass like smoke that had learned discipline. Historic England notes that many buildings dating before 1920 would originally have used candles, oil lamps, or gas mantle lighting rather than electric lighting. It is an easy sentence to pass over until you are inside a house that remembers the difference. Before 1920, electricity was not the assumed right of every room. It was an arrival, sometimes late, sometimes partial, sometimes grafted onto older arrangements. A house could live through candles, then oil, then gas, then electricity, without ever becoming one thing all at once. Ashmore had not lived through those changes. It had kept them. The oil room did not ask whether I preferred convenience. It did not care that my hand smelled afterward, or that the wick had to be coaxed, or that the glass chimney threatened to crack if heated too quickly. The room belonged to the small rituals that came before a light could be trusted. Fill, trim, strike, shield, adjust, watch. In that glow, the wallpaper showed a pattern I had not seen before. Faded leaves arranged in a repeating brown vine. In candlelight, they had looked like stains. Under the oil lamp, they became decoration again. The room was not brighter, exactly. It was more convinced. The next door had been worse. I found it by following the smell of dust warmed in metal. The room beyond was narrower than the others, with a ceiling stained above the central fitting. A bracket projected from the wall, and at its end hung what looked at first like a small white cocoon. I knew enough from Historic England's notes to recognize the suggestion of gas mantle lighting, one of those technologies that sits uneasily in the imagination between flame and electricity. Gas did not merely burn like a candle. In mantle lighting, it made a treated fabric mantle glow with a fierce, uncanny whiteness. The fitting in Ashmore was dead, or should have been. There was no reason for pressure in a pipe, no reason for any supply to remain, no reason for the little tap to resist my fingers like a living joint. But when I turned it, the room began to hiss. It was a thin sound, intimate and poisonous. Not loud, not dramatic, but close enough to make the skin tighten around my eyes. The mantle trembled. For a second, there was only the smell, sharp and old and wrong. Then the light appeared, not as a flame I could understand, but as a whiteness blooming from within the fragile mesh. The room leapt forward. The edges of the furniture sharpened wooden heady shreds. The mirror over the washstand flashed a smeh. The basin shone with an enamel glare. The gas mantle made everything too visible and not visible enough, flattening some surfaces while hollowing others. It was light with a pressure behind it. Light that announced an age of pipes, valves, fittings, maintenance, and risk. I understood then why the bellboard had gone quiet. Bells were only one network in the house. Light was another. A fixed fire bound a room to the hearth. Oil bound it to the hand that tended the lamp. Gas bound it to pipes hidden in the walls, to a supply that should have ended long ago, to small acts of turning and ignition. Each system carried its own idea of evening. Each one arranged bodies differently, where a person sat, what they could see, when work could continue. How servants moved, how danger entered, and danger did enter. In the gaslit room, my candle began to gutter violently. I had brought the wrong sentry in with me. The little wax flame no longer looked comforting. It looked impertinent, like a servant interrupting a formal dinner with news from a future no one had agreed to receive. The mantle hissed brighter. The walls seemed to draw themselves taller. The stain on the ceiling darkened into a ring, and inside that ring I saw, or thought I saw, the outline of another fitting that had once hung there. Not replaced. Superseded. That was the word that came to me. Ashmore was full of things that had not been removed when the next thing arrived. They had been left behind the surface, above the ceiling, under the floor, inside the wall. One method of living layered over another, none of them wholly dead. Historic England's work on country house technology treats these systems as physical evidence of changing comfort and convenience from the 18th to the early 20th centuries. Water supplies, flushing water closets, boilers, central heating, bells, telephones, gas lighting, electricity. In an ordinary house, such things help historians read change. At Ashmore, they were not evidence. They were appetites. I left the gas room with the tap turned back as tightly as my shaking fingers allowed. The hiss faded, but not all at once. It retreated into the wall, traveling along a line I could not see. For several seconds after the mantle darkened, I heard the house whispering through its own pipes. Then I returned to the pale line beneath the unopened door. It was still there. By now, I knew why it disturbed me. It was not merely that the light was brighter than wax, cleaner than oil, steadier than gas. It was that it did not seem to need tending. No flame leaned. No chimney smoked. No mantle hissed. It carried a different arrogance, the confidence of a room that believed light could be summoned without visible fire. I set my candle on the floorboards outside the door and watched what happened. The flame shrank. Not blown out. Refused. The wax brightened for a moment around the wick, then sagged inward, as if the candle had aged an hour in a second. A bead of melted wax ran down its side and hardened before it reached the brass holder. The pale light under the door widened by the smallest degree. Somewhere inside, there came a faint tick. Then another. Not a bell this time. Not a spring or pendulum. This was sharper, more regular, like a contact finding itself after years of corrosion. A pulse passed through the door and into the boards beneath my knees. I thought of what historic England says about the uneven arrival of electricity, that some large houses and public buildings adopted it early, sometimes with local direct current generation or even hydroelectric supply. Not every house moved from darkness to brightness in a neat line. Some rooms were fitted before others. Some systems overlapped. Some electric fittings were adapted from earlier gas fittings, leaving the new light wearing the bones of the old. The pale strip beneath the door flickered once. For that instant, the whole passage answered. The gas bracket behind me gave a tiny metallic click. The oil lamp in the distant room breathed against its chimney. In the oldest room, far back near the hearth, something in the grate settled with a soft fall of ash. Light was the house's clock, and I had been carrying a match through its hours without knowing which century I was waking. The door in front of me did not open. It did not need to. The room beyond was already awake, trembling beneath the old roof with a newer kind of life. I could feel it waiting in the wires, not warm like fire, not fragrant like oil, not whispering like gas, but quick and dry and eager. At last, the candle at my feet went out. In the sudden dark of the passage, the pale light under the door remained. And behind it, something electric began to remember. The darkness did not arrive all at once. It gathered itself around the extinguished candle, leaving the strip of electric light beneath the door as the only certain thing in the passage. That was what frightened me most. Not that the house had gone dark, but that one part of it had not. Until then, every light in Ashmore had felt like an argument with time. The hearth belonged to a room that accepted flame only when it was low and fixed in the grate. The oil lamp belonged to another, breathing through glass. The gas bracket had clicked and threatened and made the air taste faintly metallic. But the light under this door was different. It did not breathe. It did not waver with a draft. It had the dry steadiness of a thought that had already decided what I was. I put my hand on the latch and felt a vibration come through the metal. Not a sound exactly, more like a pulse. The door opened inward before I had fully turned the handle, and the room beyond seemed, at first, disappointingly ordinary. It was small compared with the state bedroom, lower and more cramped than the rooms downstairs, tucked into the angle beneath the old roof. The ceiling sloped sharply on one side, following the line of the rafters. The plaster had browned with damp in wide islands. The boards underfoot were uneven, and at the far end, a little dormer window looked out into the night with its panes blackened by rain. Yet the room was lit, not brightly. Not in the clean modern way we expect now, where a switch makes the darkness disappear without ceremony. This was a nervous, partial illumination. A single early electric lamp hung from the ceiling on a dark cord, its glass shade cloudy and shallow, throwing a pale pool over a table, a chair, and a wall crowded with fittings that did not seem to belong together. There were traces of older systems everywhere. A caped pipe ran along the skirting, bent at a right angle, where it might once have fed gas to a bracket. Beside it, fixed without elegance to the wall, was a ceramic switch mounted on a wooden patras, its surface yellowed like old bone. Insulated wires, sheathed in dark material, emerged from a hole near the ceiling and disappeared again behind a strip of timber that had been nailed up later, badly, as if someone had tried to hide the route after the fact. Near the door, the old bell wire passed through the wall, sagging slightly, sharing the space with the newer electrical line like two veins from different bodies. That was the first thing the room taught me. Technology does not enter an old house as a clean replacement. It overlaps. It adapts. It borrows the routes already made by servants, gas fitters, plumbers, carpenters, and frightened owners with money enough to modernize one part of a building while leaving another untouched. Historic England notes that many buildings dating before 1920 would originally have relied on candles, oil lamps, or gas mantle lighting rather than electricity. But it also points out that some large houses and public buildings adopted electricity early, sometimes through local direct current generation or hydroelectric supply. That small factual complication mattered as I stood under Ashmore's roof. The past was not a neat procession of candle, then gas, then electric light. For a long time, these systems coexisted. An old house could have a medieval-looking corner, a Georgian passage, Victorian service machinery, and a flicker of electrical ambition in the same body. Ashmore had not misunderstood history by mixing them. It had understood too well. The lamp trembled above me, and the room answered with a faint clicking from the wall. On the table lay a porcelain rose from an old ceiling fitting, several brass screws, a length of blackened wire, and a tarnished lamp holder that looked as though it had been removed and replaced more than once. Someone had been working here. Not recently, not in any ordinary sense, but the room preserved the feeling of interrupted labor. The chair had been pushed back. The dust on the floor showed a narrow scrape where its legs had moved. Against the wall stood a small wooden board, carrying switches and terminals, a private shrine to current, control, and risk. I remembered something I had read while trying to make sense of Ashmore's earlier moods. Historic England gives Craigside and Northumberland as one of the great examples of early domestic electricity. In 1880, Craigside used hydroelectricity to light Soane incandescent lamps. The detail had seemed almost beautiful then. Water turning into light, a country house made briefly miraculous by engineering. It had suggested progress, cleverness, confidence. A house learning to shine. But in Ashmore, electricity did not feel like progress. It felt like innervation. The old rooms had possessed memory before, but their memories had been slow. A bell pulled by no living hand. A bed preserving ceremony like a wound in silk. A room decaying with the patience of Calke Abbey's preserved decline. Those memories waited in objects, in dust, in labels, in the sag of wallpaper, and the pause before a pendulum moved. This room was different. Here, memory had been given a nervous system. The wires did not merely conduct power. They conducted attention. When the lamp flickered, I felt the rest of the house notice. Not metaphorically. I heard it. From below came the tiniest relay of responses, a bell making one dry tap against its stop, a pipe clicking as if warmed by a current that should not touch it, a floorboard settling in a room I had crossed hours before. The electric fitting under the roof was not isolated. It was connected, perhaps not in any safe or sensible plan, but in the way old houses are connected by every later alteration that uses the fabric of what came before. A wire followed a service route. A switch was fixed near a former bell pull. A lamp replaced or imitated a gas bracket. A new convenience clung to an old habit, and through those compromises, Ashmore had found a way to make one year speak to another. I stepped farther in. The air smelled of dust, warm shellac, and something faintly scorched. The lamp brightened when I moved, though I had touched nothing. On the sloping ceiling, the rafters made long bars of shadow. Between them, the plaster seemed to ripple with a dim bluish tremor, as if light were passing behind it rather than across it. On one wall was a diagram, or what remained of one. The paper had been pasted directly to the plaster and then partly torn away. Only fragments survived, lines drawn in ink, small circles, labels too faded to read, and arrows showing routes through the house. Some routes descended into the service passages. Some crossed toward the older wing. One line climbed higher, beyond the room itself, into a part of the roof I had not known existed. The house had always hidden its practical life behind walls. Bells, wires, corridors, passages, stairs. But this map suggested something worse than hidden service. It suggested intention. Not the intention of a ghost, not even of a mad architect, but of a building revised so many times that its additions had become a kind of thought. I leaned closer to the paper. The lamp above me gave one hard flicker. For a moment the ink lines became black and wet again, as if freshly drawn. I saw the plan not as a plan, but as a circulation system. Rooms feeding other rooms. Passages looped into passages. A stair that rose, stopped, and began again somewhere it should not. A corridor drawn twice, once in pale brown ink and once in darker black, as though two versions of the house had been overlaid without agreement. Then the flicker passed, and the paper returned to its torn, yellowed state. I understood then why the electric room had been placed beneath the roof. It was not the newest room in the house. It was the room that allowed the older ones to coordinate. A candle can mark a chamber. A fire can gather a family. Gas can extend evening into the public rooms. But electricity, even in this early, awkward, local, dangerous form, can link one point to another without visible movement. It can let a touch in one place create a response somewhere else. It can make a house feel less like a stack of rooms and more like a body. Ashmore had been old before the wires arrived. Afterward, it had become quick. The switch by the door moved on its own. It was only a small motion, the porcelain handle dropping with a decisive click. The lamp went out. In the instant before darkness took the room, I saw light appear elsewhere, not under the door behind me, but through a crack in the sloping wall near the floor. A narrow seam opened where I had taken the plaster for solid surface. Beyond it, another space glimmered. I knelt, and cold air touched my face. There was a passage there, not a proper passage, not one meant for visitors. It ran under the roofline, low and tight, between the outer wall and the inner rooms, a route made from leftover space. Its boards slanted. Its beams crossed at awkward heights. Far along it, a second thread of pale light shone and vanished, then shone again, as if the house were signaling from within its own bones. Behind me, in the electric room, the fittings clicked softly one after another. Ahead, the hidden passage bent where no passage should need to bend. I thought of additions, of repairs, of owners solving one problem and creating another, of old houses growing sideways across generations until their plans became less like architecture and more like memory trying to escape a straight line. Ashmore was no longer simply arranging years into rooms. It was arranging rooms into a maze. I lowered myself into the narrow space beneath the roof, following the light as it pulsed along the boards. The electric room stayed dark behind me, but its wires were awake, and somewhere ahead, the house began to turn. The passage above the electric room did not behave like a passage for long. At first, I could still tell myself that I was crawling through a practical space, one of those cramped routes old houses leave behind when convenience changes its mind. A void under the roof, a maintenance run, a place where wires could be threaded after the fact, where a later owner might have hidden the evidence of improvement behind older plaster and timber. But the longer I followed the pulsing light, the less the space seemed to belong to any workman's plan. The boards dipped, then rose. A brace crossed the way at shoulder height, forcing me onto my side. The pale wire light went ahead of me in small flashes, glancing off nails, cracked lath, and the gray fur of dust. Somewhere below, behind layers of ceiling and paper and old air, a bell gave one thin shiver and stopped. Then the passage divided. One branch sloped down toward a square of darkness. The other continued forward and ended, apparently, in a wall of rough brick. Neither option made sense. Neither seemed accidental. The house had begun to show me not merely rooms from different years, but the joins between those years, the places where one intention had been built across another and called an improvement. I chose the downward slope. It delivered me to a door that opened inward onto a landing I had not seen from below. 3 steps descended from it, then stopped against a plaster wall. There was no hall, no second flight, no reason for them to exist except the memory of a route that had been sealed. The steps were narrow, worn in the center, and cold through the soles of my shoes. I stood on the last one with my hands against the wall, feeling the faint pulse of the house through the plaster. This was when Ashmore stopped feeling like an inherited estate and began to feel like a problem in 3 dimensions. Not a haunted house, not in the simple sense. Something stranger. A house whose plan had been revised so many times that revision itself had become the governing spirit. A doorway that had once mattered could be blocked. A stair could remain after the floor it served was removed. A window could look into another room because the outside had been swallowed by an addition. Architecture, when allowed enough years and enough money and enough private will, could become a kind of labyrinth without needing any ghost to explain it. That thought led me, unexpectedly, across the world to San Jose, California. The Winchester Mystery House is often surrounded by stories. That is part of its public life now, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But the fact that matters for Ashmore is simpler, and in some ways more unsettling than the legends. The building associated with Sarah Winchester began as an 8-room farmhouse. Between 1886 and 1922, it expanded into a large and unusual mansion. After Sarah Winchester's death in 1922, it opened to the public on June 30th, 1923. Those dates matter because they give the maze a calendar. They remind us that a labyrinth can be built in ordinary time by human decisions with lumber, plaster, money, labor, delay, revision, and the refusal to stop adding. Whatever stories have gathered around the Winchester Mystery House, its usefulness to horror is not that it proves the supernatural. It does not need to. Its power lies in the documented fact of expansion, an 8-room farmhouse becoming a mansion so unusual that the building itself seems to invite interpretation. Ashmore had that same invitation in its walls. I came down from the useless steps and found a corridor where there should have been the back of the linen room. I knew this because I had mapped that part of the house 2 nights before, marking doors, fireplaces, windows, and bell pulls in a notebook that now felt almost childish. The corridor was too narrow for the estate's original dignity, but too carefully finished to be a crawlspace. It had a dado rail on one side only. The wallpaper changed halfway along, not at a corner but in the middle of a flat wall, as if one decade had run out and another had been pasted over it. At the end, a door opened into the side of a room I recognized. Or almost recognized. It was the morning room with the faded curtains and the cabinet of shells, except that the fireplace had shifted to the wrong wall. The windows were blind, not shuttered, but blind, brick behind the glass, mortared close beyond the panes. On my earlier visit, daylight had entered from that direction. Now the room had been pushed inward, or copied, or remembered incorrectly. I whispered the room's name, though I had never been told it. The house answered with a soft knock from somewhere behind the blocked windows. This is the danger of thinking of houses as stable objects. From the outside, an old building can look permanent, even authoritative. Stone, brick, gables, chimneys, deep eaves, all of it suggests a single intention. But the interior tells a more complicated truth. Houses accumulate. They are altered when families grow, when money arrives, when money leaves, when new technologies demand pipes, wires, vents, tanks, switches, bells, and routes for servants or contractors to pass unseen. One generation opens a wall. Another closes it. One owner values symmetry. Another needs a bathroom. One age wants display. Another wants comfort. The result can be factual, physical, and still feel impossible. In Ashmore, that accumulation had become conscious of itself. The morning room released me through a second door, which led to a short hall with two doors facing each other and a third door above them. Not at the end of a stair. Not on a balcony. Above them. It sat high in the wall, its threshold level with my forehead, complete with a small brass knob and a keyhole dark as a pinprick. A rectangle of carpet clung beneath it like a tongue. I stood there for a long time, looking up, trying to imagine the floor that had once met it, or the landing that had been removed, or the room that still believed it could be entered. Again, I thought of the Winchester Mystery House, not as a carnival of rumor, but as a lesson in how architecture can outgrow explanation. Its story is often told through the strangeness of its layout, through abrupt stairs, doors, passages, and additions that resist the clean logic we expect from a home. But when a building has been expanded over decades, especially from something as modest as an 8-room farmhouse into a sprawling mansion, strangeness can become a record. The maze is not proof of a haunting. It is proof that houses can preserve decisions after their reasons have died. That was the sentence I could not escape. Houses preserve decisions after their reasons have died. Ashmore preserved them too well. I tried the left-hand door. It opened onto a closet filled with rolled carpet, each roll tied with different cord. One smelled of damp wool. One smelled sharply of dust and old dye. One had a pattern of red and black flowers that seemed, in the beam of my lamp, to move a fraction slower than my hand. I closed the door before the flowers could decide on a season. The right-hand door led to another stair. This one climbed only 7 steps before turning. At the turn, the banister continued, but the steps did not. They had been cut away. Beyond them was open dark, and on the far side of that gap, another landing waited at the same height, close enough to see, too far to cross. A little framed print hung there, perfectly straight. I could not make out the image. The glass reflected my lamp, then reflected something behind me that was not there when I turned. The house was not trying to frighten me quickly. That was the worst of it. It was educating me. It wanted me to understand that a room was no longer the unit of danger. A room could dream of a year, yes. I had learned that. A state bed could remember a ceremony older than the chamber around it. A bellboard could obey fingers that were gone. A lamp could insist on oil or gas or electricity, as if light itself were a date. But a maze did something larger. It made chronology spatial. It allowed one year to sit above another, behind another, across a gap from another, separated not by time, but by a missing stair. I backed away from the cut stair and returned to the hall, beneath the impossible door. There, for the first time, I noticed the molding. It changed around the frame. The lower doors had plain trim, practical and dull, painted many times. The high door had something finer, a narrow classical edge, careful, almost scholarly. It belonged to a different idea of taste. It did not match the hall because it had not been made for the hall. It had been preserved, moved, reused, or remembered from elsewhere. Ashmore was not merely adding rooms. It was collecting architectural moments and forcing them to share walls. The next corridor confirmed it. Fragments appeared where they should not have been. A carved panel set into cheap plaster, a fanlight above a door that opened into darkness, a strip of stone flooring between 2 stretches of wood. The house was becoming less like a family home and more like an argument between builders. Or perhaps between curators. Each addition insisted on its own meaning. Each blocked passage said, "I was once necessary." Each abrupt stair said, "The plan changed, but I remained." I found myself moving more slowly, not from fear alone, but from respect. There was information in the wrongness. If I paid attention, I could almost read the sequence: a service route swallowed by a later wing, an exterior wall trapped indoors, a stair severed by an inserted ceiling, a refined doorway stranded after the room it served had been divided. These were not fantasies. Old buildings can and do hold such contradictions. Horror only sharpens the question they already ask. What happens when the contradictions begin to choose your route? At the end of the corridor, Ashmore gave me a door that was perfectly ordinary. That made it suspicious. It was painted black. with a dull handle and no keyhole.
No light showed under it.
No bell rang.
No cold air breathed from the crack.
After the high door, the cut stair, and the bricked windows, its plainness felt like a disguise. I opened it because by then the maze had narrowed my courage into habit. Beyond was a room so densely arranged that, for a moment, I could not understand its size. Models crowded the shelves. Fragments rested on brackets. Frames climbed the walls in tight formations. A small architectural cast sat above a cabinet, and above that another shelf carried shapes like ruins reduced to thought. The room did not feel furnished. It felt composed. Every object seemed placed in relation to another object, not for comfort, but for memory. The air changed there. Not older exactly, more deliberate. Ashmore's Labyrinth had led me out of accident and into arrangement. Out of additions and blocked passages and into a chamber where the mind of an owner seemed to have become architectural. I stood just inside the threshold, with the maze closing quietly behind me, and understood that a house could do more than preserve its own confusion. It could preserve a person, and somewhere in that crowded room of models, fragments, and watching frames, the house began to curate me. The first thing the room did was make me feel untidy. After the cramped turns above the electric chamber, after the blind passages and abrupt stairs that had made Ashmore seem improvised by panic, this room had a different kind of wrongness. It was crowded, yes, almost impossibly crowded, but not confused. The shelves were close. The cases were full. Frames pressed against frames. Architectural fragments leaned from brackets as if they had paused mid-fall. Yet nothing looked abandoned. Nothing had been merely put down and forgotten. Everything had been placed. That was worse. A neglected house can be endured because neglect has no grammar. Dust collects where it can. Plaster cracks along weakness. A chair left in a corner may mean grief, laziness, poverty, or no meaning at all. But this room had syntax. A painted scene faced a model. A broken capital sat near a drawing. A small staircase, no larger than my hand, stood beside a fragment of stonework darkened by age. Above it, more models rose in layers, not like toys, but like compressed intentions. The room was not showing me objects. It was showing me how to think. I had felt something like this once in London, though then I had called it wonder. Sir John Soane's museum stands at number 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields, and it is still described, before anything else, as a home. That matters. It was not designed first as a neutral gallery with clean distances between objects and visitors. It was the preserved house of Sir John Soane, the architect who lived from 1753 to 1837, and whose collections were arranged so that the house itself became part of their meaning. Soane did not simply own things. He made them correspond. Antiquities, furniture, sculptures, architectural models, drawings, and paintings were brought into relation with one another until the rooms seemed less like containers than arguments. Works associated with Hogarth, Turner, and Canaletto belonged there not as isolated trophies, but as parts of an atmosphere. A painting could speak across a room to a fragment. A model could answer a ruin. A domestic interior could become a memory machine, built to keep the mind of its owner in motion after the owner had gone still. The most important fact is also the most unsettling one. Soane arranged for the future of that house before his death. Through the Sir John Soane's Museum Act of 1833, his house and collections were to be preserved for the nation. A private interior was given a public afterlife. The rooms where one man had lived, worked, collected, studied, and staged his imagination were not allowed to return to ordinary domestic change. They were fixed, legally and materially, as a museum of him. Standing in Ashmore's hidden chamber, I understood the horror of that gesture in a way I never had before. Preservation is usually described as rescue. A house is saved from sale, alteration, dispersal, weather, fashion, fire, inheritance. Its rooms are protected. Its objects are catalogued. Its meaning is guarded. But there is another side to it, a colder one. To preserve a house as a mind is to decide that the mind must not end. It must be kept legible. It must be walked through. It must continue arranging strangers inside its old habits of attention. Ashmore had no act of parliament to bless it. No public trust.
No careful institutional language. But the effect was there all the same.
This chamber was not preserving a year, as the earlier rooms had tried to do. It was preserving a person through arrangement. I stepped farther in, and the floor answered with a tired creak that seemed too loud among so many watching things. On one wall, small-framed images climbed nearly to the ceiling. They were hung so densely that the wall itself had almost disappeared. Between them, narrow shelves held bits of molded plaster, wood, and stone. Some were classical in feeling, others domestic, others too worn to identify. Their labels, if they had ever had any, were gone. But each had been given a position, and that position felt like a kind of label. Near the door sat objects from rooms I recognized, in miniature echoes, a carved bedpost like the one from the ceremonial chamber, a tiny bell shape under glass, a lamp fitting with a ghost of gas about its curve, a porcelain switch plate whose whiteness looked feverish in the dimness. They were not the originals. They were references. That distinction should have comforted me. Instead, it made the room feel more intelligent. A heap of relics is only a heap, but a reference knows what it points toward. The house had learned the museum's most dangerous habit. It had learned that an object can mean more by being placed beside another object than it means alone. It had learned that chronology can be bent by display. It had learned that a visitor can be guided without being touched. At Sir John Soane's museum, the density of the arrangement can feel theatrical, but it is not random theater. It reflects the mind of an architect who collected fragments and models not as dead remains, but as tools of imagination. Architecture, in such a place, is never only building. It is memory, influence, quotation, ambition. A ruined form can sit beside a proposed one. A model of something ancient can hover near a model of something modern. Time becomes vertical. One idea rests beneath another. One century supports the dream of the next. Ashmore's room had taken that principle and made it hungry. The ceiling was lower than it should have been, or else the upper shelves pressed so tightly into the air that they dragged the room downward. Models occupied every level. They crowded the tops of cabinets, filled niches, and stood behind glass in shallow ranks. Some were houses. Some were facades. Some were staircases leading nowhere except into their own small shadows. Others were only partial structures, fragments translated into miniature, a pediment, an arch, a colonnade no wider than my wrist. I moved carefully because there was nowhere to move without passing close to something fragile. That, too, felt intentional. Museums often ask the body to behave itself. They train us into quiet, slow movement. They make us aware of our hands. In Ashmore, the effect was more intimate and more accusatory. My coat brushed the edge of a case, and every frame in the room seemed to notice. There was a chair near the center, but it was not placed for rest. It faced no fire, no window, no companion. It faced an arrangement of models on the far wall, stacked in receding shelves. Whoever had used that chair had sat not to relax, but to contemplate. The room's comfort had been sacrificed to looking. Domestic life had been replaced by display, and display had replaced confession. I thought of Soane again, of the strange dignity of a house that becomes a national museum. There is something generous in it, of course. The public is allowed to enter what might otherwise have vanished into private dispersal. A life's collection remains together. Students, visitors, and strangers can encounter a mind through the objects it chose and the spaces it shaped. But a preserved home is never only generous. It is also possessive. It asks the future to keep returning to the owner's arrangement. It turns change into a kind of trespass. The rooms cannot simply become rooms again. A bedroom cannot forget that it has been interpreted. A breakfast room cannot recover the innocence of breakfast. Once the house begins curating the person never completely leaves. In Ashmore, that was not metaphor. On a narrow table beneath a dark painting, I found a row of small cards. They were not printed like museum labels. They had been written by hand in a thin brown ink that had faded at the edges. Most were illegible, but one word repeated often enough for me to read it. After. Not dates, not names. After. After the bed. After the bells. After the fire. After the electric room. The cards did not describe where the objects came from. They described where I had been. A coldness moved through me with such restraint that for a moment I almost mistook it for understanding.
The house was not merely storing its own past.
It was making my passage part of the collection. Each room I entered became a reference in this one. Each fear was reduced, arranged, and placed beside older forms. The living experience was being converted into display before it had finished happening. That was when I saw the glass case at the back. It was taller than the others and set into the wall as if the wall had grown around it. Inside were models of rooms, not generic rooms. Rooms I knew. The decayed chamber with its peeling surfaces, the cabinet-lined room of specimens, the ceremonial bed, simplified but unmistakable, the service passage with its labeled board, the narrow electric space beneath the old roof. They had all been made small. Above them, on a higher shelf inside the same case, rested fragments that looked older than the house itself, broken arches, ruined walls, classical shapes reduced to pale, careful forms. The newer rooms sat beneath them, as though being judged by the ruins overhead. I leaned closer, and the glass dimly returned my face among the models. For the first time since entering Ashmore, I did not feel that I was walking through separate years. I felt that I was walking through an arrangement made by someone who understood inheritance as architecture. New dreams placed under old ruins. Private rooms placed under public memory. A house not haunted by time, but educated by it. And at the bottom of the case, where the lowest shelf waited in shadow, there was one empty space, measured and dustless, exactly the size of a room not yet made. The empty space at the bottom of the case did not look accidental. Dust had gathered everywhere else in that room. It softened the cornices of little houses, whitened the miniature stair treads, settled in the hollow windows of plaster ruins. But that one space was clean, as if a model had been lifted away only moments before, or as if the shelf had been waiting too carefully to accept one. I kept my face close to the glass and tried to make the room behave like an exhibit. That was the safest way to look at Ashmore by then. If I could name the method, I could keep the fear from spreading too quickly. Period room, service route, bellboard, gas fitting, model case. These were not magic words, but they were handholds. Each one reminded me that houses have always been layered by human decisions, by comfort, wealth, fashion, neglect, inheritance, and the long, practical history of making old walls serve new needs. But the case in front of me made the earlier rooms feel less like accidents. The models were not arranged in the order I had entered them. The first room I saw in miniature was the sealed bedroom with the great ceremonial bed, its hangings reduced to stiff folds of dark thread. Beside it was the decaying wing, with peeling wallpaper represented by tiny curling flakes of paper so fine they seemed almost biological. Lower down, I recognized the service corridor, its bellboard no larger than a playing card, each label painted in a hand too small to read, but still somehow legible to the house. There was the room of specimens, with its cabinets and glass-fronted cases. There was the electric chamber beneath the old roof, wires indicated by hair-thin black lines. There was even the cramped passage where the house had forced me to crawl after the light, the boards lifted in sections so the route could be viewed from above. They were all there, not as memories, not as souvenirs, as studies. And above them, occupying the higher shelf, were the ruins. Broken arches, fragments of classical walls, tomb-like structures, columns standing in pairs without roofs to carry. Some were pale plaster, some darker, as if made to imitate stone. They had the authority of things older than explanation. They did not belong to Ashmore, not literally, but they pressed down on the little domestic rooms below them as if ancestry had weight. That was when I thought again of Sir John Soane. In the last room, Ashmore had already pushed me toward his house at number 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, the home that became Sir John Soane's museum. Soane lived from 1753 to 1837, and his house was not merely left behind as a residence. Through the Sir John Soane's Museum Act of 1833, it was arranged to be preserved for the nation after his death. That fact had seemed strange enough when I first read it years earlier. A private home legally prepared to survive its owner as a museum of his mind. But the case before me was drawing on a more precise idea. Soane's model room is remembered for an arrangement that feels almost like a sentence written in architecture. Models of Soane's own works were placed beneath models of ancient ruins that had inspired them. Newer designs under older fragments. Personal creation under inherited forms. The architect's imagination made visible as a kind of descent. Ashmore had learned that sentence. It had not merely copied the look of a model room, it had copied the relationship. The older thing above, the later thing below. Influence made vertical. Inheritance turned into shelving. I looked again at the miniature of the state bedroom. Until that moment, I had thought of it as a room trapped around a bed, a chamber dreaming of a year older than its walls. But in the case, the bed was placed under a ruined arch. The connection was not exact. It was not historical in the clean sense a museum label might demand. It was emotional, ceremonial, architectural. The room had not chosen its year randomly. It had been placed beneath a form of grandeur already broken. The decaying wing sat beneath a fragment of wall with no roof left on it. The house was not simply preserving decline because time had damaged it. It was arranging decline beneath ruin, as if ruin were the older teacher and decay the domestic pupil. The service corridor, with its hidden wires and bells, sat beneath a model of passages cut through masonry. The house had learned that power often moves out of sight. The servants' routes, the utility spaces, the basement paths, the narrow ways by which labor disappeared from polite rooms in British country houses from the 18th century onward, all of that had not been an incidental layer. It had been placed under an older idea of concealed structure. Support without display. Work without witness. Even the lights made new sense. The rooms that had demanded candles, oil, gas, or early electricity were not just quarreling centuries. They had been sorted according to the kind of illumination they obeyed. The fixed fire as the old center of indoor light. Gas mantle brightness. Electric fittings adapted into places that had not been built for them. The house had not been confused by technology. It had been building a private history of replacement, one glow set beneath the shadow of another. The fear of that discovery was quieter than the fear of the bells. The bells had startled the body. They had made the nerves listen for a hand tugging a cord in an empty room. But the models frightened thought itself. They suggested that Ashmore was not a broken house. It was not a ghost story in the simple sense. It was an argument with rooms. Museums know that an interior can tell a story without being untouched. The Metropolitan Museum of Art warns, in effect, against mistaking period rooms for pure time capsules. A period room is an immersive interior meant to represent a chosen period, but it is still shaped by scholarship, curatorial taste, museum history, and available collections. Some furnishings may not be original to the architectural setting. They may be chosen because they help suggest how such a room might have appeared. Ashmore had taken that curatorial principle and made it physical. It had chosen. It had interpreted. It had arranged evidence until each room became convincing enough to punish disbelief. But now, in the model room, I saw the second layer of the act. It had not only built rooms that dreamed of different years, it had placed those dreams beneath older fragments, as if trying to show what each year had inherited from something already ruined. The house was not asking, "What year is this room?" It was asking, "What ruin taught this room how to exist?" That question changed the shape of my inheritance. Until then, I had imagined myself as the last owner of a place too full of history. I had thought there might be a correct date hidden somewhere inside Ashmore, a true version of the house that could be restored if I stripped away enough wallpaper, silenced enough bells, caped enough gas pipes, and chose one honest form of light. Beneath the strange additions, I had assumed there must be an original house waiting to be rescued. The model case denied that comfort. Every miniature room was already under something older. Every domestic scene was already an answer to a ruin. Even the rooms that looked newest were not free of dissent. The electric chamber, with its early ambition and sleeping wires, sat beneath the broken outline of a classical structure. The new had not escaped the old. It had only found a different way to stand under it. I moved along the glass slowly, and the room seemed to move with me. The shelves were deeper than they should have been. Reflections crossed and recrossed in the panes. My face appeared behind one arch, then inside the tiny, decaying wing, then over the miniature bellboard, like a portrait hung too low. I stepped back, and the reflections did not step back at the same speed. That was when I noticed the lowest shelf again. The empty space had a small paper label beneath it. I had missed it because the label was the same color as the wood, browned by age and almost flush with the shelf edge. It was not written in the hand that had labeled the earlier models. It was cleaner. Later. The ink had not faded as much. I bent down. There was no date, only the name of the room I was standing in. Not the model room, not the room of collections, not the chamber beneath the ruins. Ashmore had written it as if it were already complete. The model room under the ruins. I stayed crouched there for a long moment, feeling the house gather itself around me. The walls held their breath. The little rooms inside the case waited in their proper places. Above them, the fragments of old architecture remained calm and pale, their brokenness made dignified by display. The empty space was not for a room I had not yet found. It was for this room, once it had finished with me. I understood then why the glass had been returning my face among the models, not as a reflection, but as a proposal. The house was not merely documenting its interiors. It was preparing to reduce them, to make them legible, to preserve them at a scale where terror could be studied without interrupting the arrangement. And if Ashmore followed the logic it had borrowed, this room too needed something above it, some older ruin to explain it, some broken form from which its private museum had descended. I looked up. The ceiling had not been a ceiling for some time. In the dimness above the cases, where I had thought shadows gathered, fragments were suspended, pieces of cornice, cracked plaster, small sections of stair, splintered door frames, all hung carefully in the dark like relics awaiting classification. They were not ancient in the way the plaster ruins pretended to be. They were pieces of Ashmore itself. Older parts of the house had been lifted over newer dreams. The inheritance was feeding on its own remains. I backed away from the case, but carefully, because by then I knew abrupt movements made the house defensive. Behind me, somewhere beyond the crowded room, a bell gave one soft tremor. Not a summons, more like a correction. The house did not want to be solved by choosing one year over another. It did not want the old rooms restored, the decayed ones polished, the obsolete mechanisms removed, the lighting regularized, the collections thinned, the passages straightened, the museum made livable. All of those improvements would be a kind of violence against the arrangement. And yet, leaving it alone meant accepting its terms. Every room would keep dreaming. Every dream would be placed beneath a ruin. Every ruin would ask to be preserved, because something newer had learned from it. Ashmore was not falling apart without purpose. It was curating its collapse. I turned toward the door, and the model case darkened behind me. The empty space on the lowest shelf remained clean, measured, patient. For the first time since I inherited the house, I understood the choice it had been preparing for me. Not whether to believe in it, not whether to flee it. Those were smaller questions, already answered by the fact that I was still inside. The real question was whether I would restore Ashmore into silence or preserve it loudly enough that one day someone else might enter, lean close to the glass, and find a small, exact version of me waiting beneath the ruins. I left the model room with the feeling that I had not discovered Ashmore's secret, so much has been shown its method. The clean space on the lowest shelf stayed behind me like an open mouth. It did not need to call out. It had already explained itself. A house can ask to be repaired. A house can ask to be abandoned. Ashmore was asking for something more dangerous than either. It wanted to be understood. By then, I knew enough to fear that request. Understanding a place like this is never neutral. The Metropolitan Museum of Art can describe a period room as an immersive interior meant to represent a particular period of time, and in a museum, that phrase sounds orderly. It sounds like scholarship, carpentry, labels, and controlled light. In the American Wing, opened in 1924, 20 historic interiors carry visitors across roughly 300 years of domestic life, from 17th century Massachusetts to early 20th century Minnesota. The visitor moves forward because the museum has made movement safe. But the Met also gives the necessary warning. Period rooms are not untouched time capsules. They are curated spaces shaped by research, taste, collecting history, and the changing assumptions of museums themselves. Some rooms include furnishings not original to their architectural settings, chosen instead to suggest how an interior of that period may have appeared.
That was the fact Ashmore had misunderstood, or perhaps understood too well. Each room did not belong to a year. Each room performed one.
The green parlor with its fixed firelight was not the past. It was an argument about the past. The gas-lit dining room, the electric chamber under the old roof, the sealed bedroom with the state bed's royal memory, the corridors where servant bells trembled without hands, all of them were interpretations that had forgotten they were interpretations. They had mistaken atmosphere for law. And if I restored them to one clean date, I would be correcting the house by destroying the evidence. That was the trap. Restoration sounded merciful when I stood beneath a ceiling bowed with damp, when I touched paper that came away in dry flakes, when I saw the dull bloom of dust on glass cases and the sag of fabric that had once been chosen with care. A surveyor would know what to do with Ashmore. Choose a period. Strip out the contradictions. Stabilize the walls. Reroute the wires. Remove the obsolete fittings. Catalog the contents. Clean the rooms until they stopped accusing the present. There were places where that might be the right kind of rescue. But Calke Abbey had taught me another possibility. In Derbyshire, the National Trust presents Calke Abbey as an unstately home, a country house that shows decline rather than disguising it. Its rooms were preserved as they were found, with peeling wallpaper and large collections of unusual objects. The point is not neglect. The point is that decline is also historical evidence. Calke reflects about 3 centuries of country house life, and before it opened to the public, it was repaired extensively in the 1986 to 1988 campaign. Stabilized, not made young. Saved, without being forced to pretend it had never aged.
Ashmore had taken that lesson into nightmare.
It did not want rot for rot's sake. It wanted its peeling paper left legible. It wanted its obsolete wires to remain in the walls like nerves. It wanted the bellboard to keep its labels, the coiled springs, the pendulums, the different bells that once told invisible servants which room had called. It wanted the service routes, the basement turns, the utility spaces, the hidden paths that belonged to a household designed to move labor out of sight from the 18th century onward. It wanted the life of the house preserved, not merely its rooms. That was why the bells had frightened me more than any apparition could have. A ghost can be imagined as a visitor. A bell system is proof of use. Someone once pulled. Someone else once answered. The mechanism translated desire into motion, motion into sound, sound into obedience. In Ashmore, the household had vanished, but the demand remained. The same was true of the light. Historic England notes that many buildings dating before 1920 would originally have used candles, oil lamps, or gas mantle lighting rather than electric lighting. The Science Museum makes the older point even simpler. Before gas or electric lighting, the main indoor light source was often the fixed fire in the grate. Ashmore remembered that hierarchy. It knew which room expected flame, which room expected oil, which room accepted gas, which room tolerated electricity as a modern trespass with old fittings still behind it. I had thought light would help me master the house. In the end, light had been one of the ways the house mastered me. Every switch, every match, every hiss and glow was a decision about which century deserved to wake. Even the technologies beneath the comfort had become accusations. Historic England's work on country house technology names the things that usually remain half-hidden: water supplies, flushing water closets, boilers, central heating, bells, telephones, gas lighting, electricity. These were not ornaments. They were promises of convenience, privacy, warmth, speed. Each had arrived at some moment as an improvement. Each had grown old in turn. Ashmore contained all of them like abandoned remedies. Pipes that carried heat into rooms that no longer welcomed the living. Wires that carried summons from hands no one could find. Fixtures adapted from one kind of illumination to another, as if the house had tried to modernize without agreeing to become modern. It had not been built in 1 year. No house like this ever really is. The Winchester Mystery House in San Jose began as an 8-room farmhouse and expanded between 1886 and 1922 into a large, unusual mansion associated with Sarah Winchester. It opened to the public on June 30th, 1923, after her death. Whatever stories later gathered around it, the architectural lesson was plain enough. Additions can turn a home into a route without a single intention. Corridors remember decisions. Staircases remember interruptions. Doors remember ideas that did not become plans.
Ashmore had corridors like that. It had doors that opened with the confidence of mistakes.
And then there was Sir John Soane's museum at number 13 Lincoln's Inn Fields in London, where a house became a preserved mind.
Soane, who lived from 1753 to 1837, arranged antiquities, furniture, sculptures, architectural models, drawings, and paintings in a domestic space that the Sir John Soane's Museum Act of 1833 preserved for the nation after his death. His model room placed models of his own works beneath models of ancient ruins that inspired them. That arrangement still troubled me most, not because Ashmore copied it, but because Ashmore had answered it. Soane's house showed how a life could be gathered, ordered, and left behind as a museum. Ashmore showed how a house might gather lives in return. By dawn, I had reached the central hall again. The first gray light came through the high windows, thin and non-committal. In that light, the house almost looked ordinary. Dust rested on the stair rail. A crack ran through the plaster above the arch. The bells were still. The doors stood closed, each one keeping its own year quiet. I took out the packet of papers that had come with the inheritance. Legal descriptions, old repairs, a few inventories. Nothing that admitted the truth. No clause saying that the rooms dreamed. No instruction for what to do if the dead arrangements began arranging the living. And yet the choice was there in every page. If I restored Ashmore to a single date, I could make it easier to explain. I could give it a visitor route, a chosen period, a palette of approved colors, a tidy story about family, taste, decline, and preservation. I could reduce the house to one voice, but Ashmore had never spoken in one voice. It rang. It hissed. It crackled. It settled. It breathed through blocked passages and service stairs. It watched from cases where birds, mammals, fish, and reptiles had been kept, as if the world could be brought indoors and made still. It slept under embroidered hangings and woke under electric glare. It preserved decline, performance, technology, collecting, and grief all at once. To restore it cleanly would be to lie. To leave it untouched would be to surrender. So I stood in the hall and understood the final cruelty of inheritance. The house had not given me property. It had given me responsibility without instruction. It had made me the only living witness to a museum that could not be opened and could not safely be closed. Somewhere behind me, softly, one bell moved. It did not ring fully. It only trembled, as if a wire deep in the wall had remembered tension. The sound was small enough that I could pretend not to hear it. I looked toward the service door, then toward the stairs, then toward the passage that led back to the model room. I thought of the empty space on the lowest shelf, measured and dustless. Outside, morning gathered on the windows. Inside, every room waited in its chosen light. I had inherited a house where every room dreamed of a different year. By the end, I no longer believed the danger was that those dreams might end. The danger was that they might need a keeper,